When life gives you little, love can feel like wealth beyond measure.
He'd take her on trips and take her shopping. They would go out clubbing and drinking, and so it started off fun.
I know that she loved him very much.
But unchecked, it can also be all-consuming, clouding your mind.
He offered her this taste of the fast life. Her family did not have money, so she would not have been able to live the lifestyle that she was imitating.
She would have done anything to make him happy.
And when another love enters the picture, life can spiral into chaos.
Her and Champ went places together, and he was jealous of that 110%.
Her face was all bruised. He's beating you up. It had got bad.
Leading to devastating choices that leave nothing but ruin in their wake.
He was holding his son on the kitchen floor, bleeding in his arms, with his son gasping for air.
I think she really went along with anything that he said.
May 23rd, 2019. Sharon is a quaint city of 13,000 people on the banks of the Shenango River in western Pennsylvania.
Sharon, Pennsylvania was actually, the steel mills back in the 70s. It was big, it was growing, and when the steel mills went away, and it definitely has it's lost its touch, so to speak.
Today, Sharon is known as a blue-collar town that is still trying to climb its way out of the Rust Belt wreckage, but its residents are proud to call it home.
It's a nice place to raise a family and to be around family, and it's not like the hustle and bustle of a big city. It's small-town life.
But early in the morning on this spring day, tragedy strikes. At around 5:32 a.m., police and EMTs respond to a shooting on the west side of town.
A call comes in from a man who identified himself as Calvin, who's stating that someone broke in his home and shot his son, Champ. The man sounds panicked and tells dispatch to send someone as soon as possible.
When the paramedics arrive, they find Calvin still on the floor, holding his son in his hands. He's bleeding in his arms, and then paramedics render aid.
24-year-old Khalil Champ Hobson is no stranger to the first responders.
Calvin was basically a local celebrity. I mean, everybody knew him. He was a local basketball, high school star, super standout. So everybody was really, really shocked.
Calvin tells police that Champ screamed out to him that he had been shot at around 5 a.m.
Calvin tells police that he woke up after hearing 2 gunshots and immediately ran downstairs. He finds that his son is bleeding out on the kitchen floor. And standing over him was an unidentified man wearing a black mask and was holding a gun on his son, Champ.
Calvin adds that the masked man then ran out of the home without firing any additional shots.
The cops knew that this was going to be a big investigation, huge. But their main thing was to keep Champ alive. So they transported him to the hospital in Youngstown, Ohio.
Champ is in and out of consciousness and can't provide officers with any information about his attack. But his father has more to share.
As Champ was on his way to the hospital, the detectives were already processing the crime scene. After speaking with Calvin, he stated that his son Champ stated in his last breath that she let the shooters in the residence.
Calvin isn't sure of the identity of the woman his son was talking about. When he went to bed, no one else was in the home.
Champ is in the ambulance fighting for his life, but the authorities was unsure if he would make it.
Khalil Champ Hobson was a beloved figure in his town.
Everybody loved him. Once he made a name for himself playing basketball and going to school, he was just that type of person. He was well loved by everybody.
After high school ended, Champ's skills on the basketball court landed him a scholarship to an elite university.
He had gotten a scholarship, I believe, to Penn State. He was an all-around athlete, great at any ball he picked up. He was great at it.
But after only a year of college ball, Champ lost his love for the game.
We don't know why Champ didn't finish up at Penn State. All we know is he just did not return back to basketball like he planned to.
One of the comforts of home to Champ was 22-year-old Alexis Holmes, who seemed to hold a special place in his heart.
Champ is my husband's nephew, not by blood. His grandfather was married to my husband's mother. So that's where that connection comes from.
From the start, Alexis and Champ had a unique and tight relationship.
Alexis and Champ, they were best friends. I mean, it was deep-rooted. They had family ties. It wasn't biological, but they trusted each other.
But then, the relationship turned into something beyond friendship.
The relationship was far from the norm. You could see that their closeness could evolve into something physical. To most, it seemed like a friends with benefits situation, one that carried the undercurrent of genuine feelings.
Now, with Champ clinging to his life as he's transported to a local hospital, his family is wondering who could have had it out for the beloved basketball star. Detectives want to give them an answer as quickly as possible. As police continue to question Champ's father at the crime scene, they receive some terrible news from the paramedics who were trying to save Champ's life.
As Champ was en route to the hospital, he died before he could even make it there. He fought for his life bravely, but there was nothing that the paramedics could do to save him.
When police tell Calvin that his son had died, it was an emotional shock. He collapses and he just loses it. I mean, he just had so much going for himself. His father loved him so much, and he reacted just as any father would.
After the detectives give Calvin some time to grieve, they continue their line of questioning about who may have wanted Champ dead.
He tells the detectives that the shooter was a black male, thin build, wearing all black, and the gun appeared to be a 9mm pistol.
As it turns out, Champ wasn't the only victim.
As police search the home, they also find that Champ's dog, Blue, was shot and killed. It was believed that the dog confronted the perp at the kitchen door, and the perp felt threatened. And then he shot the animal and made entry into the home, where he later shot Champ.
This is looking like a home invasion gone horribly wrong. There was no forced entry, so whoever it was, he either let him in or this person had a key. This was a rough neighborhood, so police were quick to consider that theory.
In the kitchen, detectives find 2 spent shell casings that they believe are from a 9mm weapon.
After finding the gun casings, the detectives think that only 2 shots were fired. One shot was at Champ, and the other one was at his dog, Blue.
And the shell casings aren't the only items detectives find in the home.
As detectives process the crime scene, they see several thick black bands. These were the types of rubber bands that you would use to wrap cash, and they're collected as evidence.
But the most important piece of evidence is found on a table near the kitchen.
In the home, detectives finds a purse, but Calvin says only he and Champ lives there. When detectives open the purse, they find a driver's license inside. The driver's license belongs to a woman named Alexis Holmes.
The detectives really have a mystery on their hand, but the driver's ID is crucial. It tells the detectives that Alexis was in the home that night, and that information is crucial.
Police have several leads in the murder investigation of Champ Hobson. His father, Calvin, tells police that Champ was with a mystery woman on the night of his murder.
After Champ was shot by the masked man, his father really tried to help him. Champ told his father she let the shooter inside. And during the initial investigation, the detectives find a purse in the home that belongs to Alexis. So the trail of clues are leading to Alexis, but the detectives still have a full investigation to uncover.
Police aren't sure why Alexis was there that night or if she's involved, but she is the main person they want to talk to at that moment.
Just because police finds her purse doesn't mean that she has any connection to the murder. So detectives need to keep an open mind here.
The word has gotten out to the community that Alexis was in the house. Alexis's family urges her to go to the police before the detectives get involved.
Alexis arrives at the police station at 10 a.m. and sits down with detectives, eager to share her story about the shooting.
Right after everything happened, that same day they talked to her. And that is when she gave them the story of her and Champ were out on the porch when 2 gunmen came up and, attacked Champ.
Alexis states that she and Champ went outside and 2 masked individuals stormed the porch and she ran. As she ran, she alleges she heard 2 gunshots. Since she only heard the dog moan, she believed that only the dog had been shot. Alexis claims that she didn't know whether Champ had been injured or not, but she didn't want to hang around to find out.
After hearing this, detectives intentionally don't tell Alexis that Champ has died. They want to see just how much she knows about the shooting.
Alexis tells police that the masked gunmen were both black males, medium height and build, but she had no idea who they were.
So she says that she froze when everything happened, and when she finally did get her wits about her, she jumped over a fence and ran to the corner and called one of her friends to come and get her. And somebody came and got her, and she took off.
Alexis says the friend who picked her up is named Christine Allen.
This is a vital clue because now detectives have another witness to question. They hope that this is a step in the right direction to solve Champ's murder.
But police aren't done questioning Alexis. Detectives ask why Alexis was at Champ's house on the morning of the break-in.
Alexis tells the detectives that she went to Champ's house after midnight because she was having problems with her boyfriend, Eddie Robinson. She essentially told detectives that she needed to vent. And she tells the police that she did some drugs with Champ, but then passed out on the couch. She woke up around 5 a.m. and Champ was already up. She told the detectives that they went to smoke on the porch, and that's when the 2 gunmen arrived.
When detectives ask why someone would want to rob Champ, Alexis says that the basketball star has a secret life.
Alexis tells detectives that Champ and his dad were selling drugs from the home. And this was apparently well known in the community. In fact, Champ was known to keep thousands of dollars in the home, and that is what made him the mark.
At the end of Alexis's interview, police ask her if she tried calling Champ after fleeing the house to see if he was okay.
Alexis alleges that she sent several messages to Champ on Snapchat, which is how she normally communicated with him. What's unique about this is that the younger generation uses Snapchat because it deletes information after a certain amount of time. So for now, detectives have no way of confirming whether or not Alexis really did reach out to Champ after the shooting.
Detectives decide it's time to break the bad news about Champ to Alexis.
She was visibly shook, so upset, crying, couldn't hardly talk. It was a trauma.
Alexis has a reaction that you would expect. She cries and gets very emotional. Someone who meant a lot to her was murdered.
But detectives remain skeptical about Alexis's story.
Police don't have enough evidence to keep Alexis, so they have to let her go. Detectives ask Alexis if they can have her phone for investigative purposes, and she agrees. Detectives ask Alexis where her boyfriend Eddie lives, and she provides that information. At first glance, it appears as though Alexis is not trying to hide anything.
As police officers search for Alexis's boyfriend, Eddie, detectives also want to follow a few leads that surfaced after their initial interview with their star witness.
This case is getting bigger and bigger after Alexis' initial statements, and there's more players involved now. The one thing the police need to do is question Calvin about Champ's alleged drug dealing.
A quick background check by police reveals that Calvin himself has multiple drug charges on his criminal record.
Champ's father had actually been arrested multiple times for selling drugs throughout his life. He was actually on probation for it when his son was murdered.
When police speak to Calvin about the allegations, he is somewhat cagey about his son's affairs.
Calvin denies being involved in any drug operation. He states that this would violate his parole terms. He's not saying he knows about it, and he's not saying he didn't know about it.
Detectives asked Calvin whether or not his son Champ kept any large amounts of money in the home, and Calvin stated that he really wasn't sure.
For now, detectives can't rule out that this was a random attack on Champ for drug money, but police still feel something else is at play.
Detectives couldn't get past why Champ would use his last words to say she let the shooters in. So it's almost like he was trying to help solve his own shooting. And that's what sort of sticks to the police throughout this investigation.
With so many investigative paths to follow, detectives first decide to track down Christine Allen, the friend Alexis claims picked her up from the crime scene on the morning of the shooting.
The detectives were actually able to locate Christine and speak to her about 10 hours after the shooting. She was living at her mother's house, and they asked her to come into the station for an interview. She agrees to come with her mother.
When Christine comes to the police station, the detectives note that she's very nervous.
When the investigators ask her if she had anything to do with the murder, Christine denies any involvement.
Christine stated that she was with her mom the morning of the shooting and never once left the home. Because her mother was with her at the police interview, she quickly confirmed her story. Christine tells detectives that Alexis did contact her the morning of the murder, but it wasn't for a ride. She says that it was to tell her that Champ had been shot.
Now police have caught Alexis in another lie. She initially tells the police that she did not know that Champ had been shot. Yet she told her friend Christine that he was shot hours after the incident. And she also lied about how she left the crime scene after the murder. It makes the police wonder, what else is she lying about?
After speaking to Christine, police have a strong feeling that Alexis is more involved in Champ's death than she originally indicated. And when a forensic analysis is completed on her cell phone, their suspicions only grow.
When the detectives finally get Alexis's phone records, they find some alarming discrepancies. Alexis appeared to be texting her boyfriend, Eddie, constantly throughout the night. Alexis was giving Eddie minute-by-minute details about what Champ was doing while she was inside the home.
Alexis thought that she had deleted those messages. Police had the technology to recover those deleted messages.
There were several messages to Eddie several weeks prior to the murder, planning to rob Champ. It appears as though Alexis and Eddie planned this whole robbery together.
Detectives in Sharon, Pennsylvania, think they know who killed Champ Hobson. They believe it's Alexis Holmes and her boyfriend, Eddie. But they are still a long way from proving it.
Police have a lot to unpack. They now know Alexis and Eddie plan to rob Champ of his drugs and his money. It was an inside job based on Alexis' text messages to her boyfriend. But what they don't know is who actually shot Champ. Alexis stated that there were 2 shooters, so police have a lot of ground to cover.
Right now, the main thing detectives want to know is the location of Eddie Robinson.
When police initially talked to Alexis, she told them where Eddie lived. But there's one problem. No one's home, and no one knows where Eddie is.
Detectives decide to circle back with Alexis to see if she knows where her boyfriend is. But just 24 hours after Champ's murder, Alexis is now gone too. Detectives put out an APB for Eddie and Alexis.
With every passing hour, it looks as if Alexis and Eddie murdered Champ. So police need to figure out how all of this happened and why, and who pulled the trigger.
As patrol units search for Alexis and Eddie, detectives take some time to learn about Alexis and their relationship.
She was my baby, the youngest of my 5. She was quiet, but as she got older, she started opening up more, was into sports. She loved makeup, she loved dressing up, she loved looking good.
As a student in high school, Alexis showed a lot of promise.
Great student. Any teacher you talked to about her loved her. She never wanted to miss school.
But after Alexis graduated from high school, she had her mind set on only one thing: finding a man.
Alexis knew she was going to marry a rich man. That's all she said. She's like, Mom, I'm going to shop and I'm going to live that glorious lifestyle and I'm going to marry me a rich man. And I'm like, okay, if that's what you want.
Until she found the perfect man, Alexis worked as an exotic dancer at a club to pay the bills.
You're meeting men in areas of society that are on the other side of the law. And those are the big spenders in those clubs. So she was exposed to that.
And it was at the club where she met the man of her dreams, 27-year-old Eddie Robinson.
I didn't care for him when she was bringing him around. He was just too quiet. Not shifty, shady. I kind of watched him.
After a few months of dating, Alexis moved into a home with Eddie.
Throughout the relationship, they would fight. It got bad, and she would leave and come back home because she always had a room in my home. And he would call, and then they would go and they would argue. And I mean, it was toxic.
Eventually, Eddie became physical with Alexis.
So one night she called me and she's like, "Mommy and Eddie just fought," and her face was all bruised. It had got bad. Like he's leaving marks on you now. He's beating you up, but she just wouldn't leave him alone.
By now, Alexis had stopped working at Eddie's request. And despite the abuse, she couldn't bring herself to walk away.
Now she depends on him. It's abuse full circle. It's an abusive pattern. Don't work, let me take care of you. So now when we argue and I decide that I'm gonna grab you or choke you or smack you, where are you gonna go?
He would shower, like he would take her on trips and take her shopping and, the whole thing guys do to get her mind off the real, problem, and she would just go along with it. But it started getting worse and worse and worse, to the point where they would break up. And then she'd be like, "Mom, he's taking me to the Bahamas, and now we're back together." So that was their relationship.
In the midst of it all, she maintained a relationship with Khalil, even though it caused tension in her relationship.
There's some degree of safety in terms of her relationship with Khalil because they've always known each other. And so she's always had that avenue to go back to. But yet and still that codependency kept her back with him.
When detectives speak to Alexis's mother, Sheila, and ask how Eddie has the means to live so lavishly, Sheila tells them that Eddie is a drug dealer.
He came to my house one day with drugs, and I told him, "You have to take that out of here." He thought he was going to prepare it and I told him, "You can't do that."
Sheila tells the detectives that she believes her daughter and Eddie may have a drug addiction.
They would get high together. I know that for a fact. I watched my daughter spiral into this person.
Detectives ask Sheila if her daughter used Champ as a means to get back at Eddie.
They were friends, so her way of making Eddie mad would be to let him know, "I'm with him right now." She knew he'd be mad about that.
As officers wrap up their interview with Sheila, they encourage her to call them if Alexis comes around. About a week after Champ's murder, police find something near Alexis's home that helps shed some light on the investigation.
As detectives continue to process the crime scene, they notice that there are surveillance cameras all around. The detectives notice that there is a camera pointed directly at Alexis's home, and they request to see the footage.
After scanning through hours of video footage, police hit pay dirt.
In a video clip the day before the murder, the cameras catch Alexis walking outside. She walks to a barbecue grill and places the gun inside and walks back inside the residence.
But the video evidence doesn't end there.
At some point in the video, a man pulls up, resembling Eddie, pulls up in a white sedan. So he gets out of the car, walks over to the grill, pulls out a gun, and then he leaves.
Police have to wonder, was this the murder weapon? And was Alexis the person who ordered the hit?
Alexis is increasingly seeming like the instigator in this murder. Detectives can't uncover the truth until they find the couple. With no leads, they're stuck until a flood of tips start coming in.
Investigators have two prime suspects in the murder of basketball star Champ Hobson. There's just one problem. They both are on the run.
From the start of the investigation, detectives suspected Alexis. After detectives look at the footage, they know that her boyfriend is involved too. The two are seen handling a gun that detectives believe is the murder weapon.
Also seen in the video is Eddie driving a white Ford sedan.
The detectives are able to get a license plate for the vehicle and learn that it's registered to Alexis. So this is the vehicle that Eddie drove away in, and now this has become the centerpiece of the investigation.
With Alexis and Eddie on the run, the entire Sharon community fears for their safety.
Champ is known by everyone and loved by everyone. Yes, he sold drugs, but people said that he gave his money back to the community. He would buy children shoes so they can play sports. He also hosted food drives for people who needed warm meals. So this is a person who cared about his community. For him to be gunned down in his home was terrifying for the people of Sharon.
As police search for Alexis and Eddie, tips from the community start flooding in.
This crime happened in 2019, so everybody was talking about it on social media. And they keep seeing comments that Alexis is known for setting people up for Eddie. And it seemed to be something that the two do together.
The local rumor mill paints Eddie as a master manipulator who had total control over Alexis.
It happened so fast, especially when you're talking money that she couldn't make for herself. And it gets to the point where, you kind of don't have an identity of your own. You look around like, okay, now what? I don't even know what to do at this point. I've gotten myself to a point where I don't even know how to get out of this.
Detectives believe that Alexis and Eddie are a dangerous combination. The couple remains on the run for 2 weeks, but they aren't exactly keeping a low profile.
As Alexis and Eddie is on the run, police is getting tips from the community about them. Someone calls the police and tells them that Eddie and Alexis was seen in a Walmart in Youngstown.
It appears as though they're on a shopping spree. They bought jewelry, clothes, and electronics. They had stolen this money from Champ. They were reckless, and the police wanted them off the streets.
Luckily, shortly after, the Sharon Police Department gets the break they have been looking for.
About 2.5 weeks after the murder, a patrol unit spots a white Ford sedan parked in the parking lot of a Hampton Inn in Austintown, Ohio. The location of the hotel is approximately 30 minutes from where Champ was killed. When the police run the plates, it comes back to Alexis Holmes.
After nearly a 3-week search, police are close to catching Alexis and Eddie.
Police believe that Alexis and Eddie are armed and dangerous, so they ask for a SWAT team to help them apprehend the fugitives. They have no idea if this couple plans to go peacefully or violently.
The SWAT unit learns what room they're staying in and surrounds the unit.
Alexis opens the door, and the detectives are able to swarm them and arrest them without incident. As they're detained, Alexis screams that she didn't mean for this to happen and starts crying uncontrollably.
After their apprehension, police search Alexis and Eddie's vehicle and hotel room for evidence.
Shockingly, Alexis and Eddie didn't have any weapons on them, so police think that Eddie got rid of the weapon.
But there is still a mountain of evidence that links them back to the crime.
In the vehicle, the detectives find $12,000 wrapped in a rubber band under the floorboard.
When confronted by the discovery, Eddie claims it's his money.
What's important about this discovery is not the money, but the evidence from the black rubber band that's surrounding the cash. The style of the rubber band was the same style of rubber band that was found in Champ's home after the robbery. So it links the money back to the crime scene.
When word gets back to Champ's family that they have been caught, his father is elated.
Calvin must have had mixed emotions. This murder not only took his son from him, but it tore the family apart. Alexis was involved, but she was also a part of the family.
Both Alexis and Eddie agree to talk to police about the murder, and what they have to say shocks everyone.
After detectives arrest Alexis, they thought that she would come clean. What they didn't expect was for her to actually cover for Eddie and stand by her man. She wanted to protect him.
Alexis Holmes and Eddie Robinson have just been arrested for the murder of Champ Hobson. And now, police want to know who masterminded the plan and how it all went down.
When the detectives get to the station, they view Alexis as the weakest link. They think Alexis likely got sucked in by Eddie, so they focus in on her first.
Alexis sticks to her initial story.
She says that she and Champ were outside smoking on the porch and two masked men approached them. She maintains that she had no idea who these masked men were, and she ran to save her life.
When asked if her boyfriend Eddie had anything to do with the murder, Alexis denies the accusation.
Through it all, she stands by her man and she stands by her story. And she thinks for the time being, if she keeps quiet, that it'll all go away.
But what Alexis doesn't know is that in an interrogation room next door, Eddie is talking to the police about everything.
While Alexis is standing by Eddie, loyalty isn't a two-way street. Eddie is telling the police that he had nothing to do with the murder and he was at home. He even tells the police that he had no idea who Champ was, but tells police about Alexis's involvement.
Eddie tells police that on the night of the murder, Alexis called him crying, and he picked her up from a place near where the murder took place.
Eddie tells detectives that when he picked Alexis up, she told him that Champ was dead. This is the same time that Alexis admits that she's sleeping with Champ. Eddie says that he had no prior knowledge of this.
When police ask why he went on the run with Alexis, Eddie states that he did no such thing.
Eddie tells police that he and Alexis were planning to go on a trip for a while, and it was just a coincidence that it happened right after Champ's murder.
But what Eddie doesn't realize is the evidence police found on Alexis's phone when she was initially interviewed contradicts his statement.
When Alexis turned in her phone, they recovered those deleted messages, and they saw everything that was said about Champ. It was clear to everyone that Alexis and Eddie carried out this plan together. They were both caught in a lie.
When confronted by the evidence, Eddie admits to lying to police, but he maintains he didn't kill Champ.
Eddie finally comes clean and admits that he and Alexis planned to rob Champ, but they did not plan on killing him. He tells detectives that Alexis was helping Champ sell drugs and told him about the money. He then states that the other masked man that was with him that night was Ant, and that Ant was actually the one that pulled the trigger.
For investigators, it's the first time they have ever heard of a man named Ant being involved in the murder.
So this adds into another person that they have to find, interview, and prove guilty. So police aren't gonna stop until they find everyone involved and put all of them behind bars.
At the end of the interview, Eddie maintains that the plan was never to kill Champ. He was simply trying to get money that was owed to him by Alexis.
The most surprising thing about Eddie's interview is how quickly he distanced himself from Alexis. He tells detectives that Alexis was the one who planned the robbery so she could get money to pay back the money she owed him for the car. And Eddie maintains that he kind of just went along with it to get his money.
But police know this is a lie.
All of the text messages clearly showed that Eddie was encouraging Alexis to participate in this robbery. The messages also showed that Eddie was real jealous of Champ. Eddie wanted Champ to pay because of the sexual relationships that he had with Alexis. Eddie was clearly in charge of this entire thing.
After detectives get Eddie's full statement, they want another shot at convincing Alexis to talk.
Alexis stays loyal to Eddie during her interrogation. When detectives reveal what he was saying next door, everything changed. She's in conflict because she loves Eddie, but she's in fear because of the abuse. She realized that he wasn't protecting her the way she was protecting him, and she woke up.
In the interrogation room, Alexis finally decides to come clean.
Alexis tells the detectives that it was Eddie's plan to rob Champ. Alexis stated that Eddie recruited his friend Ant to help because he knew Champ had money and guns in the home. Alexis also states that killing Champ was never in the plan, and Eddie acted on that alone. She says when Eddie picked her up in the car, he admitted to shooting Champ. So Eddie saying that Ant was the shooter was a lie. He was just trying to protect himself.
After a 3-week investigation, detectives feel confident in their case against Eddie Robinson and Alexis Holmes. There is just one lingering question. Will their case hold up at trial?
This was no slam dunk case because prosecutors didn't have the murder weapon. There was a third conspirator that was yet to be apprehended. And there was a real possibility that this entire prosecution could be jeopardized just for that reason.
Holmes and Eddie Robinson have just been charged for killing Champ Hobson. Alexis admits to her part in the crime, but blames the murder on her boyfriend, Eddie. But Eddie says he wasn't the trigger man.
After Alexis and Eddie are arrested, all of this turned into he said, she said, with both people trying to avoid being labeled as the mastermind. So Eddie initially denies everything, but then admits some involvement. He tells police that his friend Ant was the shooter.
Police put out an APB for Ant, but they keep their focus on Alexis and Eddie.
As police begins the trial, Alexis lawyers up. She plans to fight the charges. She maintains that she was in a toxic relationship with Eddie and that he was behind the entire thing.
The potential defense was, I didn't know it was going to happen. As I got into the case, I found out there was ample evidence that put the shooter and Alexis together throughout the evening. Just made it a very hard case to defend.
When Alexis hears that Eddie is taking a plea deal with prosecutors, she decides to take a deal herself.
So, my really strong advice to her was to take this plea because there's a huge difference between 15 years and life.
To avoid a criminal trial, Alexis agrees to plead guilty to robbery and burglary charges. She is sentenced to 18 to 40 years in prison.
The DA told her, I'm going to make sure you get life in prison. That's what he told her. You'll do life. You don't take this plea and you go to trial, I'll make sure you get life, is exactly what he said. She had no choice.
I wish she would have went down there and from the very beginning just said, hey, this is what happened and I'm afraid. And this wasn't what I intended. She would have been in a lot better place.
Eddie Robinson pleads guilty to murder and animal cruelty and receives 15 to 45 years in prison.
As a part of Eddie's plea deal, he agrees to testify against his own friend, Ant.
In 2024, Sean Dante Devon Perry, a.k.a. Ant, pled guilty to 1 count of robbery and was sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison.
When Ant is convicted, it was like the cherry on top because finally there was a sense of closure for Champ's family. Everyone who was involved with this was now facing the consequences for their actions.
As for Alexis, she serves her time now thinking about what her life would have been if she hadn't fallen in love with the wrong man.
She's told me she's learned plenty of things. She said, I have to pick and choose the right things to do, whether it's my relationships, the way I live. She's learned that hard lesson. She said, I lost somebody that I loved, and people will never understand that.
I think a young woman could learn from Alexis's story that maybe not to trust a man as much as Alexis trusted Eddie, because I think she really went along with anything that he said. She went along with, here's the gun. She went along with, here, I'll let you guys in, and left with them and everything, and then went on the run with Eddie shopping and everything. So, I think she really trusted Eddie through all this, and that was her downfall.
Eddie is a person who has, kind of stripped her of a lot of things, almost probably alienated herself from her family, which means that it allowed for her to just, she's kind of like there for him. She's like codependent, actually, where she's constantly dependent on him for everything. If you don't do what you're told to do or asked to do, then what do you have? So she feared losing everything. So therefore, she just went along with it.
The winter wind howling off Massachusetts Bay in November 1974 did not just bring a biting, sub-zero freeze to the brick-lined alleys of Boston's historic North End. It carried a dense, suffocating terror that would paralyze the community for over half a century. It was an era defined by tight-knit neighborhoods where multi-generational families lived stacked in brownstones, where local merchants knew every child by name, and where the front door was left unlocked during the day. But on that bleak, overcast Tuesday morning, inside a charming third-floor apartment on Hanover Street, the collective peace of the city was violently, systematically dismantled. A 21-year-old nursing student, admired for her kindness and dedication, was discovered lifeless on her bedroom floor, the victim of a crime so calculated and vicious that it completely defied the quiet, predictable rhythm of the neighborhood. There were no shattered window panes, no missing jewelry on the vanity, and no signs of a forced breach, only a heavy, unnatural silence left behind in a room where a young life had been abruptly extinguished in the dead of night. The initial panic rippled through the dense Boston streets like a shockwave, turning lifelong neighbors against one another, replacing friendly morning greetings with suspicious, defensive glances, and locking deadbolts that had remained untouched for decades. First responding detectives stepped into a pristine crime scene that yielded absolutely no obvious clues, a chillingly orderly horror that suggested the predator moved like an invisible specter, leaving behind a mountain of questions and an agonizing, permanent dread. The damp Atlantic air grew thick with paranoia as the community realized the monster they feared did not drift into town from some distant highway, but was quite likely someone who walked those very brick pavements, someone they passed in the market every single day. As the weeks bled into grueling months, the frantic flashing of blue police lights faded, the yellow barricade tape was torn down, and a crushing, cold realization set in that the system was running out of leads. The thick manila folder was eventually stamped with the devastating label of a cold case, buried at the bottom of the state homicide archives to gather dust while a broken neighborhood attempted to heal an open wound that fiercely refused to close. Decades rolled past like a slow-moving train, transforming the young, energetic patrolmen who first secured the perimeter into gray-haired, retired old men and fading the memory of that horrifying night into a dark, local legend whispered in corners by those old enough to remember the panic. The world outside accelerated, the analog 70s dissolved into the digital age, and the physical landscape of the North End gentrified, but the unresolved shadow of 1974 remained heavily anchored to the brickwork, a silent phantom hovering over every neighborhood gathering. The cardboard evidence box sat undisturbed in the dark, a quiet monument to human limitation, until a specialized cold case task force, armed with molecular extraction tools the original investigators could only dream of, decided to wake the sleeping files. They were not looking for forgotten eyewitnesses, for most had long since been laid to rest in the city's cemeteries, nor were they searching for a discarded weapon. They were hunting for the microscopic biological ghosts left behind on the materials preserved from the scene. Deep within the climate-controlled evidence locker, sealed inside a yellowed, brittle plastic bag, lay a single silk scarf recovered from the victim's bedding, holding a genetic secret that had survived 52 years of absolute obscurity. It was a high-stakes gamble against the total degradation of organic material, a desperate attempt to extract a digital blueprint from an ancient phantom, but as the modern laboratory sequencers hummed to life, the forgotten past began to violently collide with the present. The historic breakthrough did not arrive with a dramatic siren or a loud explosion, but with a quiet, glowing notification on a high-definition monitor. A complete, high-density male DNA profile had been successfully pulled from the ancient, tight weave of the silk threads. The modern hunters now possessed an infallible biological signature, but they still lacked a name, forcing them to launch a complex, digital dragnet through the vast expanses of investigative genetic genealogy, tracing a killer's bloodline back through generations of public records. The genealogical search led them down a winding, intricate path of births, marriages, and military deployment records stretching across multiple states, steadily narrowing the biological circle closer and closer to Boston, until the digital trail stopped dead at the doorstep of the most unthinkable, highly protected location imaginable. The target of the multi-jurisdictional raid was not a hiding fugitive entrenched in an underground bunker or a hardened career criminal with a lengthy rap sheet, but an 80-year-old resident of a peaceful, manicured retirement community in the quiet suburbs just outside the city limits. This was a man who had spent the last 5 decades living a life of pristine, unimpeachable respectability, a gentle grandfather, a retired utility worker, and a quiet neighbor who was deeply loved by the care staff for his soft-spoken demeanor and his dedication to gardening. To execute a capital murder arrest warrant on a frail senior citizen inside a community built for peace would send a devastating shockwave through the region, requiring investigators to secure an ironclad piece of direct, modern evidence before triggering the dynamic takedown. A plainclothes surveillance detail was deployed to the facility, blending seamlessly into the background of visiting families and medical staff, their eyes locked onto the aging suspect as he went about his predictable, quiet routine of apparent innocence. The definitive moment of truth occurred not in a high-speed pursuit, but in the mundane, quiet setting of the facility's communal sunroom, where the elderly man sat enjoying his morning tea while watching the birds outside, completely oblivious to the hidden cameras tracking his every movement. When he stood up from his armchair, adjusted his walking cane, and shuffled back toward his residential wing, he left behind a disposable paper cup resting on a small wicker table, a careless piece of modern trash carrying the definitive biological key to unlocking a 52-year-old urban nightmare. An undercover detective moved with swift, silent precision, intercepting the discarded cup before a janitor could clear it away, sealing the old man's fate inside a sterile, airtight evidence bag destined for immediate forensic comparison. The laboratory validation was instantaneous and staggering in its exactness. The fresh DNA profile extracted from the rim of the paper cup matched the historic profile from the 1974 silk scarf with a mathematical certainty that obliterated any possibility of an alibi or a mistaken identity. The bright Tuesday morning of the tactical takedown sent a profound, paralyzing shockwave through the suburban neighborhood that made the historical horror feel fresh and immediate, as a convoy of unmarked black tactical units swarmed the quiet drive of the senior living center. Elderly residents and care nurses watched from the windows in absolute, frozen disbelief as state troopers escorted the gentle, white-haired patriarch out of the lobby in heavy steel handcuffs, his head bowed against the flashing strobe lights but his pale face remaining chillingly vacant and unreadable. The carefully constructed mask of vulnerable old age had been violently ripped away by the hands of modern science, exposing the terrifying reality that the monster who had shattered Boston's peace had spent an entire lifetime hiding in plain sight, wrapping himself in the protective camouflage of a peaceful retirement while the world forgot his crime. Inside the sterile atmosphere of the precinct interrogation room, faced with the cold, unyielding graphics of his own genetic code, the old man's grandfatherly demeanor instantly withered away, replaced by an icy, heavy silence that spoke louder than any verbal confession ever could. The realization that they had lived alongside a killer, that they had trusted him with their families and celebrated milestones with him, left the entire community reeling in a state of collective, acute psychological trauma. The historic courtroom during the preliminary hearings was packed to absolute capacity, a claustrophobic gallery of deep betrayal, as the graphic, long-hidden details of that cold 1974 November night were finally laid bare under the bright lights of modern justice. There was no grand justification offered, no complex motive revealed, only the dark, pathetic reality of an ordinary man who had committed an extraordinary act of violence and used 50 years of time as a shield to escape the earthly consequences of his depravity. As the judge's gavel fell with a heavy, echoing thud, sealing the octogenarian's fate to spend the remaining days of his life behind the concrete walls of a maximum security penitentiary, the city of Boston was left to confront the permanent scars on its history. The ancient cold case was officially solved. The Phantom of Hanover Street finally possessed a definitive name and a face, but the chilling echo of that 1974 winter morning would linger forever in the brick corridors of the North End, an unyielding reminder that the ultimate darkness does not always hide in the shadows outside, but can sit quietly among us, growing old in the light. The mechanical hum of the laboratory sequencers inside the state police forensic headquarters carries a strange, detached neutrality, a sound completely separated from the human agony trapped within the evidence samples spinning inside the vacuum chambers. To the technicians handling the ancient materials, the silk scarf was not a relic of a stolen life, but simply a matrix of degraded organic fibers labeled as Exhibit B, 1974, a puzzle requiring the systematic isolation of foreign cellular material from the background noise of half a century of storage. In 1974, the concept of DNA profiling existed only in the far reaches of science fiction. The original detectives could do nothing more than catalog the victim's blood type and note the total absence of foreign hairs or fibers that could lead to a suspect. They were fighting a modern predator with primitive, mid-century tools, mapping out timelines on paper ledger books and relying on shoe-leather neighborhood interviews that inevitably dried up when faced with a killer who left no physical footprint behind. The cardboard box containing Chloe's personal items became a time capsule failure, sleeping through the rise of computerized databases and the dawn of the digital age, a silent witness to the passage of generations while the man who had left his biological signature on her bedding walked the earth with total freedom. The dynamic shift that brought the Hanover Street folder out of the darkness of the archives did not begin with a fresh anonymous tip or a sudden crisis of conscience from a historical witness. It was triggered by a systemic, automated review of unsolved capital offenses initiated by a new generation of data-driven investigators. Detective Marcus Thorne, an analytical specialist who had spent his career tracking historical crimes through the lens of modern technology, pulled Box 1974 from the deep shelves of the county repository, struck by the absolute clean precision of the original crime scene photographs. He recognized that the total absence of forced entry did not just mean the victim knew her attacker. It indicated a level of environmental comfort, a predator who moved through the historic brownstone with the absolute confidence of someone who belonged in that space. Thorne carried the yellowed plastic evidence bags into the clean room of the molecular unit, knowing that while the physical paperwork had grown brittle and faded, the microscopic language written into the fabric strands was an unalterable, permanent record waiting for the right tool to decode its message. The process of pulling a usable genetic profile from a 52-year-old fabric sample is an exercise in molecular surgery, a meticulous battle against the natural forces of decay, humidity, and time that constantly threaten to dissolve the chemical bonds of the DNA chain. Dr. Elena Vance utilized an advanced differential extraction technique, using chemical lysis buffers to systematically dissolve the structural proteins of the silk fibers while leaving any foreign cellular material intact. The ancient DNA was severely fragmented, broken into thousands of tiny, disjointed segments like a priceless ancient text that had been put through a shredder, making standard criminal database searches completely impossible. To overcome this limitation, the laboratory deployed next-generation sequencing, a revolutionary technology that analyzes hundreds of thousands of single nucleotide polymorphisms simultaneously, allowing a high-powered computer algorithm to stitch the shattered genetic fragments back together until a flawless, high-density digital blueprint emerged from the forensic mist. When the completed profile was run through the National Codes network, the system returned a cold, immediate notification of 0 matches, confirming that the killer had never been arrested for a felony or logged into a state criminal system in the decades following the 1974 murder. He was a ghost on paper, a man who had successfully navigated 50 years of adult life without ever leaving a single legal footprint in the criminal justice system, and realization that could have stalled the investigation permanently in a previous era. But Thorne immediately bypassed the blind spots of the law enforcement networks, moving the high-density SNP data file into the expansive, borderless world of investigative genetic genealogy, uploading the killer's biological code into massive consumer-facing databases where millions of ordinary citizens had submitted saliva samples to trace their family heritages. The algorithm began its silent search through the global digital grid, measuring the microscopic shared segments of DNA between the unknown predator of Hanover Street and the millions of everyday users who had used home ancestry kits out of nothing more than innocent historical curiosity. The digital dragnet did not identify the suspect directly. It mapped out a complex, glowing network of distant cousin matches, tracing a shared biological lineage back to a specific family tree rooted in the rural farming communities of western Massachusetts during the early 20th century. Forensic genealogists spent 3 weeks of continuous, round-the-clock research reverse engineering the family tree, cross-referencing public birth certificates, marriage registries, historical census records, and military draft cards to track every male descendant within the bloodline. The vast branches of the family tree were systematically pruned based on geography, age, and physical availability during the winter of 1974, narrowing the focus from hundreds of potential relatives down to a single, isolated line of descent that led straight back into the heart of Boston. The genealogical circle tightened around a single individual, Arthur Pendleton, a man whose name had never once appeared in the original 40-volume police file, a completely anonymous citizen who had vanished into the background of the city while the investigation collapsed into BTAC. The modern background profile compiled on Arthur Pendleton revealed an individual who had constructed a life of absolute, bulletproof normalcy, a career as a dedicated technician for the Boston Edison Utility Company, an unbroken marriage spanning 40 years, and a reputation as a quiet, completely unremarkable family man who raised 2 children in a modest suburban home. In 2018, following the passing of his wife, Pendleton had sold his property and moved into the serene, highly protected environment of the Whispering Pines Senior Living Facility, transitioning into the twilight of his life, surrounded by the profound respect of the care staff and his fellow residents. To the community that loved him, he was a gentle patriarch who spent his afternoons tending to the courtyard rose bushes and playing chess in the sunroom, a vulnerable old man whose quiet existence was a testament to a life well lived. No one who watched him walk through the manicured gardens with his silver walking cane could have imagined that beneath the fragile exterior lay the cold, unrepentant heart of the Hanover Street monster, a predator whose dark secret had remained safely buried beneath 50 years of public respectability. The logistics of the surreptitious collection operation at the retirement home required a level of operational security approaching a military intelligence strike, as Thorne understood that a single leaked word or a visible police presence would cause an immediate explosion of public outrage and potentially tip off the suspect. A team of plainclothes state investigators, dressed in the civilian attire of visiting family members and medical delivery technicians, entered the facility over a 3-day period, mapping out Pendleton's daily movements and identifying the optimal window to secure a clean biological sample. The opportunity presented itself on a crisp Tuesday morning inside the facility's communal sunroom, a space flooded with bright morning light where Pendleton sat completely alone in a high-backed armchair, slowly sipping his tea from a standard disposable paper cup while completely absorbed in a book on historical gardening. The surveillance team maintained a discreet perimeter, their hidden cameras capturing every movement of his lips against the white plastic rim, documenting the physical transfer of hundreds of fresh epithelial cells that would ultimately seal his fate. When Pendleton finished his tea, closed his book, and used his cane to slowly stand and navigate his way back toward his residential wing, he left the disposable cup sitting carelessly on the small wicker table next to his chair. Routine gesture of abandonment that legally transformed his unique biological identity into discarded trash. The moment the heavy glass door of the sunroom clicked shut behind the old man, an undercover detective stepped forward with a seamless, practiced motion, drawing a pair of sterile forceps and an airtight security pouch from inside his jacket. He secured the cup by its base, ensuring no contact with the rim, and sealed it inside the anti-contamination bag before the facility staff could clear the table, rushing the package directly to a waiting transport vehicle idling outside the gates. The laboratory processing was executed under an emergency priority status, the technicians working through the night to extract the fresh saliva cells and compare them directly against the high-density matrix pulled from the 1974 silk scarf, the entire weight of a half-century-old investigation hanging on the alignment of the digital peaks on the monitor. The definitive validation report arrived on Detective Thorne's desk at 3:45 a.m., the scientific text devoid of emotion but carrying a profound, history-altering finality. The DNA profile from the paper cup matched the profile from the Hanover Street crime scene with a statistical deviation of less than 1 in 700 trillion. The science had delivered its unanswerable verdict. The gentle grandfather of Whispering Pines was, without a shadow of a single doubt, the elusive predator who had stolen Chloe Sterling's life in the winter of 1974. Armed with the signed capital murder warrant and a series of comprehensive search orders for Pendleton's residential suite, Thorne and a convoy of state tactical units moved toward the retirement facility just as the first hints of dawn began to break over the suburban horizon, prepared to shatter the peaceful illusion that had protected a killer for an entire lifetime. The tactical units swarmed the manicured driveway of the facility at precisely 7 a.m., their unmarked black vehicles blocking the exits while team members moved rapidly through the main lobby, their faces grim and unyielding as they bypassed the stunned reception staff and headed straight toward the residential wing. The arrest was executed with absolute precision inside the doorway of Suite 114, just as Pendleton was preparing his morning breakfast, the sudden intrusion of armed state troopers instantly freezing him in place against his kitchen counter. He did not cry out, he did not reach for a weapon, and he did not offer a single word of protest as the heavy steel handcuffs clicked around his frail, wrinkled wrists, his tall frame drawing down as if the invisible weight of his 52-year secret had suddenly become a physical force that crushed his spine. As he was led through the carpeted corridors of the facility, his head bowed against the bright fluorescent lighting, the care nurses and elderly residents stood lining the walls in a state of absolute, paralyzed horror, their minds entirely unable to reconcile the image of their gentle garden keeper with the cold-blooded monster of the Hanover Street cold case. The subsequent interrogation at the high-security downtown precinct was a masterclass in psychological collapse, as Detective Thorne laid out the genetic evidence, the ancestral family trees, and the bright crime scene photographs from 1974 on the table between them. For the first 2 hours, Pendleton attempted to maintain his vulnerable, grandfatherly persona, speaking in a low, trembling whisper about memory lapses, confusion, and mistaken identity, his wrinkled hands shaking as he reached for his water cup. But as Thorne systematically detailed the mathematical certainty of the DNA match, showing how the molecular signatures from the paper cup and the silk scarf were identical down to the smallest allele marker, the old man's defensive facade completely splintered, revealing a flat, dead stare that had remained unchanged since the night of the murder. He did not offer a theatrical confession or a detailed explanation of his long-hidden motive. He simply looked away from the photographs, his absolute silence confirming the monstrous truth that the city of Boston had spent 52 years desperately trying to uncover. The public release of the arrest details sent a monumental shockwave through the historic neighborhoods of Boston, destroying the collective memory of the tragedy and replacing it with a profound, sickening sense of violation that touched every citizen who had ever carried the scar of 1974. The realization that an active killer had spent his entire adult life enjoying the safety, the love, and the opportunities of the city he had terrorized created a collective sense of trauma that was nearly impossible for the public to process. The courtroom during the preliminary hearings was a suffocating, claustrophobic arena of raw emotion, packed with the surviving relatives of the victim, childhood friends who were now elderly citizens, and ordinary people who wanted to look into the eyes of the man who had beaten the system for half a century. The cold case was officially closed. The genetic signature on a simple paper cup had proven that time possesses no power to wash away the stain of a capital crime, but as the prison doors locked Arthur Pendleton away for the remainder of his natural days, the city was left with the chilling knowledge that the ultimate evil can live among us, growing old in the peace of the light while the truth waits in the dark. The quiet that returned to the courtyard of Whispering Pines in the days following the raid was not the peaceful serenity the facility had been designed to cultivate. It was a heavy, radioactive silence that contaminated every conversation and left the care staff moving through their routines in a state of profound emotional paralysis. The rose bushes that Arthur Pendleton had tended to with such meticulous, daily care stood beautiful and blooming under the autumn sun, their vibrant colors now looking like a grotesque parody of life against the backdrop of the yellow police tape that still sealed the entryway to Suite 114. The residents who had spent their evenings playing chess with the old man or listening to his quiet stories about growing up in post-war Boston found themselves looking at their own memories with a deep, corrosive cynicism, wondering how a mind capable of such gentle companionship could house the dark, unyielding memory of a savage homicide. The psychological armor of the community had been breached by the unassailable precision of modern forensics, leaving behind a vulnerability that no amount of administrative reassurance could ever hope to repair. Inside the State Homicide Bureau, Detective Marcus Thorne spent the weeks following the arraignment systematically dismantling the massive administrative empire of paper that had grown around the 1974 file over 52 years. He cross-referenced Pendleton's historical employment records with the Boston Edison Company against a series of other unresolved disappearances and cold cases that had occurred along the utility corridors of New England during the late 70s and early 80s. What he uncovered was a subtle, terrifying pattern of geographical proximity, unexplained folder entries, missing persons reports from isolated towns where Pendleton had been deployed on long-term repair contracts, none of which had ever been linked to the quiet technician who always returned home to his family on the weekend. The file was transforming from a singular resolution into a historical gateway, suggesting that the Hanover Street murder was not an isolated flash of madness, but the opening chapter of a covert, lifelong trajectory of violence that had remained hidden behind a veil of absolute civic compliance. The legal defense team assembled for Arthur Pendleton realized within 48 hours of reviewing the state's forensic brief that any attempt to contest the physical evidence in front of a Boston jury would be an act of legal suicide. The combination of the next-generation sequencing profile from the historic silk scarf and the fresh STR analysis from the surreptitious coffee cup collection left absolutely no room for alternative suspect theories, contamination arguments, or chains of custody challenges. They initiated a series of quiet, confidential plea negotiations with the district attorney's office, seeking to secure a permanent transfer to a specialized medical prison facility in exchange for a full waive of his right to a trial and future automatic appeals. Throughout these high-stakes maneuvers, Pendleton remained housed in a secure infirmary unit at the county jail, his physical framework deteriorating rapidly under the sudden transition from suburban luxury to the cold, clinical reality of state incarceration, his eyes remaining fixed on the concrete floor as if he had completely withdrawn from the human world. The old brownstone on Hanover Street, the physical space where the tragedy had originated in the winter of 1974, still stands, its brick facade weathered by over 50 years of Atlantic storms, its interior long since renovated into high-end luxury apartments for the city's tech elite. The young professionals who walk past the property on their way to the financial district do so without looking up, the historical details of the nursing student's murder having transitioned from a bleeding, active community wound into a static line of data in a digital archive. The city has evolved, the old neighborhood networks have dissolved into the generalized geography of a modern metropolis, and the names of the original investigators have been carved into the headstones of local cemeteries, leaving the resolution of the cold case to exist as a technical triumph of science rather than an act of personal closure. The paperwork is filed, the boxes have been moved to the permanent historical registry, and the man who ran out the clock on his own life sits in the absolute, sterile quiet of his concrete cell, completely silent as the winter wind begins to howl off the bay once again, washing over a world that finally brought its phantoms out into the light. The brickwork of Boston's North End carries a heavy, structural memory, its narrow, labyrinthine alleys and towering brownstones absorbing centuries of human footsteps, maritime history, and the quiet, domestic routines of immigrant families. But on November 19, 1974, that historic fabric was permanently stained by a crime of such cold, calculated ferocity that it fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of the entire community. The victim, 21-year-old nursing student Rosemary Lynch, was the pride of Hanover Street, a dedicated, compassionate young woman who spent her days working at the local clinic and her nights studying by the light of a small desk lamp in her third-floor apartment. When her roommate returned from an overnight shift at the Boston City Hospital at 6:15 a.m., she expected to find the kettle cooling on the stove and Rosemary dressing for her morning rounds. Instead, she stepped into a freezing, unnatural stillness that instantly triggered a deep, instinctual panic. The apartment door was unlocked, a detail that was not uncommon in the close-knit North End of 1974, where neighbors regularly slipped into each other's kitchens to trade ingredients or share morning gossip. But as the roommate pushed past the threshold, she noticed the radiator was dead, the cold autumn wind rushing into the hallway from the interior of Rosemary's bedroom. Inside the small room, the light from the street lamps outside cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene of absolute, devastating horror. Rosemary lay lifeless on her small wooden bed, her body positioned with a chillingly neat, deliberate precision that suggested the killer had taken his time after the life had left her. The bedsheets were pulled up to her chest, her hands folded over her midsection, her eyes staring blankly at the cracked plaster ceiling in an unblinking, permanent expression of terror. The initial response from the Boston Police Department was a chaotic explosion of blue sirens, shouting patrolmen, and flashing flashbulbs that drew hundreds of residents out onto the brick pavements of Hanover Street in their nightgowns and heavy winter coats. Among the crowd was a young, ambitious patrolman named Thomas Egan, a man who had grown up on those very streets and knew the Lynch family personally. Egan was tasked with securing the front entrance of the brownstone, forcing back the hysterical crowd of neighbors who demanded to know what had happened to their beloved Rosemary. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust, fried fish from the ground floor market, and the freezing Atlantic salt air, creating a suffocating, claustrophobic atmosphere that would remain burned into Egan's memory for the next 52 years of his life. Inside the third-floor apartment, the primary homicide investigators were immediately confronted with a maddening, contradictory lack of traditional forensic evidence. There were no signs of a violent break-in. The locks on the windows were intact. The iron fire escape outside showed no fresh scuff marks or disturbed soot, and Rosemary's handbag remained untouched on the dresser, its brass clasp shining under the investigators' flashlights, holding her cash, identification, and a half-written letter to her parents. The apartment had not been ransacked. No drawers had been ripped from their tracks, and no valuables had been disturbed. The killer had entered the apartment with a singular, hyper-focused purpose, executed his horrific act of violence in total silence, and left behind an environment that was almost completely devoid of physical clues. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment at the scene confirmed that Rosemary had been terminated via high-pressure asphyxiation, a process that left distinct, dark petechial hemorrhages in her eyes and deep, localized bruising around her delicate neck structures. The primary instrument of her death was still present at the scene, wrapped tightly around her throat like a grotesque, material signature, a vintage, patterned silk scarf that belonged to Rosemary herself, taken from her dresser drawer before the assault began. The utilization of an item from the victim's own home suggested a terrifying level of familiarity and opportunistic calm. The killer had not brought a weapon with him, operating instead with a cold, spontaneous efficiency that left the seasoned detectives scratching their heads in total frustration. By the second week of the investigation, the initial wave of community grief had mutated into a deep, toxic paranoia that completely destroyed the social architecture of Hanover Street. If there was no evidence of a forced entry, and if the apartment was located on the third floor of a highly secure brownstone, it meant the monster did not climb through a window in the middle of the night. It meant he walked through the front door. He was quite likely someone Rosemary knew, someone she trusted, or someone who possessed keys to the building itself. The hardware stores along Atlantic Avenue completely ran out of heavy deadbolts, security chains, and window locks within 48 hours as families fortified their homes against a threat that they realized was already sitting inside their perimeter. Detectives conducted hundreds of systematic, door-to-door interviews, cataloging the timelines and alibis of every male resident within a 5-block radius of the crime scene. They interviewed the local grocers, the delivery truck drivers, the construction workers who were repairing the nearby elevated highway, and the student groups who frequented the neighborhood's Italian cafes. Thousands of pages of manual typewritten notes were generated, filling thick cardboard binders that were stored in the basement archives of the precinct, but every lead they followed rapidly dissolved into a dead end. Every suspect had an alibi that checked out. Every potential lead turned out to be based on nothing more than fearful speculation, and the mountain of paperwork grew taller without ever pointing in a single, definitive direction. During this period of intense anxiety, a local utility worker named Arthur Pendleton was one of the many ordinary citizens who stood on the sidewalks, watching the police operations with a quiet, respectful interest. Pendleton was a 28-year-old technician for the Boston Edison Company, a quiet, polite young man who was frequently seen walking through the North End with his leather tool belt and his distinctive blue company uniform, repairing the aging electrical infrastructure of the historic tenements. He was a familiar, non-threatening presence in the neighborhood, a man who regularly tipped his hat to the local housewives and shared a cup of espresso with the shopkeepers after completing a repair job. No one who saw him working calmly on the telephone poles or checking the meters in the basements could have possibly imagined that his fingers had been the ones to pull the silk scarf tight around Rosemary's throat. As the years drifted from the 1970s into the 1980s, the physical evidence collected from the Hanover Street apartment sat inside a standard cardboard repository box in the basement archives of the state police headquarters, a silent monument to an unsolved tragedy. The silk scarf, the victim's bedding, the latent fingerprint cards that yielded nothing but smudges, and the clothing Rosemary wore on the night she died were sealed in heavy plastic pouches, preserved in a primitive state of mid-century forensic science that was entirely incapable of reading the biological secrets written in their fibers. The case was eventually stamped with the devastating label of a cold case, its energy completely dying out as the original investigators retired from the force, passed away, and were replaced by a new generation of lawmen who knew the Lynch murder only as a historical ghost story. The neighborhood of the North End underwent a massive, decades-long process of gentrification that systematically erased the community that had known Rosemary Lynch. The old Italian markets were replaced by high-end boutique clothing stores. The brick brownstones were converted into multi-million-dollar luxury condominiums for the city's tech elite, and the families who had lived stacked on top of each other for generations moved away to the outer suburbs. The memory of the 1974 murder faded from a living, bleeding community wound into a distant, historical curiosity, an old article that could be found in the digital microfiche archives of the library by true crime researchers or local history buffs. But while the world outside moved forward into the digital age, the biological signature of the killer remained completely unchanged, sleeping inside the dark layers of the evidence box, waiting for the science of the future to cross 52 years of time and unmask its creator. The turning point that brought the Hanover Street file out of its half-century hibernation occurred in the spring of 2026, when Detective Marcus Thorne was assigned to the newly established Cold Case Identification Unit. Thorne was an analytical specialist who believed that time was not an enemy of justice, but an asset, allowing technology to catch up with crimes that had beaten the primitive methods of the past. He pulled Box 1974 from the deep shelves of the county repository, struck by the absolute structural neatness of the crime scene photographs. He recognized that the total lack of chaos did not just mean the killer was calm. It meant he possessed an extraordinary level of confidence within that specific physical environment, details that suggested he was someone who had a legitimate, unquestioned reason to be moving through the building in the middle of the night. Thorne carried the brittle, yellowed plastic bags into the clean room of the state's molecular forensics unit, focusing his attention squarely on the primary instrument of the crime, the vintage silk scarf that had remained wrapped around Rosemary's neck until the coroner cut it away during the autopsy. He knew that modern forensic extraction techniques did not require a visible bloodstain or a massive pool of bodily fluid to build a definitive identity profile. They utilized the science of touch DNA, the systematic collection of microscopic epithelial cells that every human being sheds constantly from their hands and skin, trapped deep within the tight weave of natural fibers like silk due to the intense physical friction involved in a manual strangulation. The process of pulling a usable genetic sequence from a 52-year-old fabric sample was an extraordinary technological challenge that required weeks of preparation and specialized chemical agents. Dr. Elena Vance, the lead molecular geneticist, used a high-powered forensic vacuum system equipped with a sterile microfilter to lift the ancient cellular debris from the knots and seams of the silk scarf. The recovered DNA molecules were severely degraded, fragmented into thousands of short, incomplete chemical chains by decades of exposure to temperature fluctuations and plastic storage conditions. Standard forensic amplification tools would have returned nothing but an unreadable smear of data, but Dr. Vance deployed next-generation sequencing, NGS, a revolutionary technique that can read hundreds of thousands of individual genetic markers simultaneously, allowing a computer algorithm to stitch the shattered biological blueprint back together until a pristine, ultra-high-density male DNA profile emerged from the digital mist. The completed profile was run through the National CODIS network, but the federal and state criminal indexes returned a cold, immediate notification of 0 matches, confirming that the perpetrator had successfully lived his entire adult life without ever being arrested for a felony or logged into a law enforcement system. Refusing to let the investigation stall a second time, Detective Thorne shifted the high-density SNP data file into the borderless world of investigative genetic genealogy, uploading the unknown killer's code into public consumer repositories where millions of everyday citizens had voluntarily submitted their DNA to trace their ancestry. Within hours, the digital dragnet began to return a complex, glowing web of partial matches, tracing a shared biological bloodline back to a specific set of great-grandparents who had operated a leather tannery in the Berkshire Mountains during the late 19th century. Forensic genealogists spent 3 weeks of continuous research reverse engineering the family tree, tracking every male descendant within the lineage through census logs, public birth certificates, marriage registries, and historical utility company employment records. The sweeping net systematically eliminated hundreds of relatives based on age, military deployment history, and geography, until the branches of the family tree converged on a single, isolated line of descent that led straight back to Boston. The digital trail stopped dead at the name of Arthur Pendleton, an 80-year-old citizen who had vanished into the quiet background of the city while the initial investigation collapsed into total BTAC in the winter of 1974. The modern background checks compiled on Pendleton revealed a life of absolute, unassailable respectability that stood in horrifying contrast to the brutal reality of the forensic match. He had worked for 40 years as a loyal technician for Boston Edison, raised a family in a modest suburban home, and had recently retired to the Whispering Pines Senior Living Community, a peaceful, highly protected facility located in the quiet suburbs just outside the city limits. To the nurses, care staff, and fellow residents who lived alongside him, Arthur was a gentle, soft-spoken patriarch who spent his afternoons tending to the facility's courtyard rose bushes and playing chess in the sunroom, a vulnerable senior citizen whose quiet existence was a testament to a life well lived. The surveillance operation that followed was conducted with the precision of a military intelligence operation, requiring plainclothes state investigators to blend into the facility's background to secure a direct reference sample without alerting the suspect. The breakthrough occurred on a Tuesday morning inside the facility's communal sunroom, where Pendleton sat completely alone in a wicker armchair, enjoying his morning tea from a disposable paper cup while completely absorbed in a book on historical New England architecture. When he stood up, adjusted his silver walking cane, and shuffled back toward his residential wing, he left the disposable cup sitting carelessly on a small side table, a routine gesture of abandonment that legally transformed his unique biological identity into common trash. An undercover detective moved with swift, silent precision, intercepting the discarded paper cup before the facility janitor could clear the room, sealing the pastor's brother's fate inside a sterile evidence pouch destined for immediate forensic validation. The laboratory comparison was instantaneous and staggering in its exactness. The fresh STR profile extracted from the saliva on the rim of the coffee cup matched the historic profile from the 1974 silk scarf with a mathematical certainty that defied any possibility of an alibi or a mistaken identity. The biological signature of the gentle grandfather who tended the retirement home roses was an identical, absolute match to the signature of the monster who had left Rosemary Lynch dead on her Hanover Street bed 52 years before. The morning of the tactical takedown sent a profound, paralyzing shockwave through the suburban neighborhood as a convoy of unmarked black vehicles swarmed the quiet drive of Whispering Pines. Care staff and elderly residents watched from the large glass windows in absolute, frozen disbelief as state troopers escorted Arthur Pendleton out of the main lobby in heavy steel handcuffs, his head bowed against his chest but his pale face remaining chillingly vacant and unreadable. The carefully constructed mask of vulnerable, peaceful old age had been violently ripped away by modern science, exposing the terrifying reality that the predator who had shattered the city's peace had spent an entire lifetime hiding in plain sight, wrapping himself in the protective camouflage of an ordinary retirement while the world forgot his crime. As the heavy steel doors of the transport vehicle clicked shut, erasing him from the community he had deceived for half a century. Detective Thorne knew that the cold case was officially closed, but the chilling echo of that 1974 winter morning would remain forever in the brick corridors of Boston, an unyielding reminder that the deepest darkness can sit quietly among us, growing old in the light. The unmasking of Arthur Pendleton did not occur within the localized boundaries of traditional police work. It was achieved in the silent, borderless expanse of the digital cloud, where billions of genetic data points are sorted, mapped, and translated into human lineages. For 52 years, the killer of Rosemary Lynch had existed in the minds of Boston homicide detectives as an abstract concept, a phantom without a name, a footprint, or a criminal record. He was the ghost who had walked through the third-floor apartment door on Hanover Street, pulled a silk scarf tight into a fatal knot, and then stepped back out into the freezing November night, vanishing into the ocean of ordinary citizens that flooded the city's utility grids every morning. Traditional law enforcement networks had proven entirely blind to his presence because he had never crossed the legal boundaries that would trigger a biometric logging. He was a man who went to work, paid his taxes, maintained his marriage, and kept his yard clean, operating with a level of social discipline that made him functionally invisible to a system that only looked for monsters in the shadows of recidivism. When Detective Marcus Thorne shifted the investigation from the closed, criminal parameters of the CODIS database into the expansive realm of investigative genetic genealogy, he was transitioning the manhunt from the physical streets of the North End to the vast expanses of historical human migration. The data file generated by next-generation sequencing was an ultra-high-density matrix containing over 800,000 single nucleotide polymorphisms, the unique, individual variations in a human genetic code that act like a microscopic map of a person's biological heritage. This data file did not contain a name, a driver's license number, or an address, but it contained something far more dangerous to a hiding predator: the immutable, mathematical signature of his bloodline. By uploading this profile into public consumer repositories like GEDmatch and FamilyTreeDNA, the investigation was leveraging the innocent, historical curiosity of millions of ordinary citizens who had submitted their own saliva samples to discover their roots, completely unaware that their family trees would become a digital dragnet for a historical killer. The algorithmic processing inside the genealogy databases began its work at 2:15 a.m. on a Thursday morning, cross-referencing the 800,000 markers against millions of pre-existing user profiles across the globe. The system was searching for segments of shared DNA measured in centimorgans, looking for long, identical strings of genetic text that indicated a recent, common ancestral origin. The first major breakthrough appeared on the technician's monitor as a sharp statistical spike. A user registered under a standard family genealogy profile who shared approximately 145 centimorgans with the unknown suspect of Hanover Street. This number was a powerful beacon. Mathematically, it meant that the user was not a distant, colonial-era relation, but a second cousin or a first cousin twice removed to the individual who had left his biological signature on Rosemary Lynch's bedding in 1974. Dr. Sarah Lynn, the lead forensic genealogist collaborating with the state task force, immediately began the exhausting, meticulous process of reverse engineering a multi-generational family tree based on that single genetic connection. This was a process of historical architecture, an inverted pyramid where investigators started with a living person in 2026 and forced their way backward through decades of documentation to find the common ancestors who bound them to a ghost. For 3 weeks, Dr. Lynn's office looked less like a modern laboratory and more like a historical archive, the desks covered in digitized property deeds, birth registries, marriage licenses, military enlistment papers, and water damage census logs stretching back to the late 19th century. The research systematically traced the Oklahoma user's maternal lineage back to a specific couple, Silas and Abigail Pendleton, who had operated a modest dairy farm and timber business in the Berkshire Mountains of western Massachusetts during the early 1900s. Silas and Abigail had been a prolific couple, raising 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls, who grew up in the rural isolation of the Berkshires before the economic realities of the mid-20th century forced them to scatter across the state, their descendants multiplying into a massive, multi-branch lineage that spanned across multiple East Coast jurisdictions. This is the most critical phase of the genetic mapping, Dr. Lynn explained to Detective Thorne as they sat before a high-definition monitor displaying the vast, color-coded branches of the Pendleton lineage. We have the ancestral trunk of the tree, but now we have to systematically prune every single branch based on 3 absolute forensic criteria: gender, age, and geographical availability during the specific week of November 19, 1974. If a descendant doesn't fit all 3 parameters perfectly, they are eliminated from the grid. The digital siege that followed was a masterclass in comprehensive background tracking, requiring Thorne to run thousands of automated checks through state motor vehicle registries, high school yearbook archives, corporate tax records, and municipal directories stretching across a 50-year window. Many of the male descendants within the Pendleton bloodline were eliminated from the suspect matrix almost immediately. The software tracked one cousin who was serving overseas in a naval detachment in the Western Pacific in 1974, another who had been confined to a medical facility in Upper New York following a severe industrial accident, and several who had settled permanently in the Western states, with absolutely no documentation connecting them to the New England region. The sweeping net slowly, inexorably tightened around the descendants of Silas's second son, Arthur Pendleton Sr., who had moved his family east to the working-class suburbs of Boston in the late 1940s. Arthur Sr. had raised 2 sons, a brilliant, academically minded boy named William, who would eventually enter the ministry and relocate to the southern states, and a quiet, insular younger son named Arthur Jr., born in October 1946. When Detective Thorne's eyes locked onto the historical timeline of Arthur Pendleton Jr., the data nodes on his monitor began to shift from a neutral gray to a bright, alarming crimson. In November 1974, Arthur Jr. was 28 years old, the exact demographic profile generated by modern behavioral analysts who had reviewed the physical dynamics of the Hanover street crime scene. Furthermore, his employment logs with the Boston Edison Utility Company confirmed that he was not just living in the city at the time of the murder. His specific work crew was assigned to a long-term contract modernizing the underground electrical conduits along Atlantic Avenue and Hanover Street, putting him physically within yards of Rosemary Lynch's apartment building every single day. The realization that their primary suspect was an 80-year-old resident of an upscale senior living center completely altered the tactical matrix of the operation, turning a routine cold case resolution into an incredibly volatile social and legal emergency. Arthur Pendleton Jr. was not a career criminal who could be pulled out of a vehicle during a routine traffic stop. He was a revered patriarch within his suburban community, a man whose life on paper was a testament to absolute civic compliance and quiet, domestic dignity. To walk into the county courthouse with nothing more than a consumer genealogy report and demand an arrest warrant for a frail senior citizen would trigger an immediate wall of institutional resistance, potentially leaking the information to his family, resulting in the sudden destruction of whatever secondary personal records remained in his possession. The legal standards for a prosecution based on investigative genetic genealogy required law enforcement to secure a direct, standard reference sample from the suspect's own body to compare against the historical crime scene evidence in a controlled, state-approved forensic environment. The public genealogy records were legally defined as a powerful lead, an arrow pointing toward a suspect, but they did not constitute primary, admissible evidence in a capital murder trial. Thorne needed Arthur Pendleton's actual biological material, and he had to obtain it through a high-stakes, covert investigative method known as a surreptitious collection, the systematic retrieval of abandoned property in a public space, an operation that required the target to remain completely oblivious to the fact that the state was closing in on his 52-year-old secret. The deployment of Operation Hanover Shadow was initiated on a Monday morning under a cold, leaden sky that seemed to reflect the grim, unyielding nature of the task at hand. A specialized detail of plainclothes investigators from the state's Major Crimes Division, operating in civilian clothing that allowed them to blend seamlessly into the background of visiting families, medical couriers, and delivery personnel, established a continuous, 24-hour surveillance perimeter around the Whispering Pines senior facility. The operators were equipped with high-powered telephoto lenses disguised as ordinary digital devices, directional microphones, and encrypted logging networks, their sole objective to document every action, every habit, and every item handled by the aging suspect inside his manicured sanctuary. The surveillance logs kept during those initial 48 hours revealed a portrait of a man who was utterly, completely secure within his camouflage, his daily movements displaying the serene, unbothered rhythm of an individual who believed that time had washed away the blood on his hands. Arthur Pendleton lived a life of clockwork precision, his retirement years dictated by a quiet, grandfatherly routine that projected nothing but peace, vulnerability, and gentle wisdom. Every morning at 7:30 a.m., he would exit his private suite, walk slowly down the carpeted corridor with his silver walking cane, and spend an hour sitting in the facility's central courtyard, tending to the rose bushes with a pair of small pruning shears, his interactions with the passing staff filled with soft-spoken pleasantries and gentle smiles. He was the ideal resident, an elder statesman of the facility who was deeply loved by the care nurses for his compliance and his quiet, dignified demeanor. A man who spent his afternoons reading historical novels or playing chess with other residents in the sunroom, entirely insulated from the violent reality of his past by the deep reverence of the community around him. To the investigators watching through the long lenses from the unmarked vehicles parked outside the gates, the contrast was profoundly unsettling. There was no nervousness in his posture, no scanning of the perimeter, no sudden shifts in behavior that would indicate a conscience burdened by the memory of a young nursing student screaming into the fabric of a silk scarf in the winter of 1974. The primary tactical challenge for the surveillance team was finding the precise environment where Pendleton would handle and discard a biological sample in a manner that allowed for an immediate, clean extraction without any risk of environmental contamination or intervention from the facility staff. The retirement home was meticulously maintained, the janitorial crews clearing tables and washing dishes with an aggressive efficiency that made the collection of a standard ceramic mug or a metal fork nearly impossible without alerting the suspect or his attendants. Thorne knew they needed a situation where the pastor's brother was operating outside his standard domestic layout, using a disposable item that would be treated as common waste, free for the state to claim under the established legal doctrines of abandoned property. The critical opportunity finally materialized on the morning of the third day of the operation. At 9:15 a.m., the weather broke, a brilliant, cold autumn sun clearing the mist from the suburban landscape and drawing the residents out toward the communal sunroom, a large, glass-enclosed space that looked out over the western gardens. Pendleton shuffled into the room alone, wearing a casual tweed jacket over his silver cardigan, his leather-bound book on historical architecture tucked under his arm. He approached the beverage station, filled a standard disposable paper cup with hot chamomile tea, and seated himself in a high-backed wicker armchair in the far corner of the room, completely isolated from the other residents who were gathered near the television monitors on the opposite side of the pavilion. The surveillance team moved with instantaneous, silent coordination, their operational protocols clicking into place with mechanical efficiency. Two undercover operators, looking entirely like a pair of visiting middle-aged brothers reviewing a medical brochure, entered the sunroom through the rear corridor, securing a small table less than 12 feet from Pendleton's position. A third investigator remained positioned in a utility vehicle outside the glass panels, utilizing a stabilized digital video system to maintain a continuous, unedited recording of the pastor's brother's hands, documenting every contact between his mouth and the white plastic rim of the cup to ensure the chain of custody could never be challenged by a defense expert. For 45 minutes, the tension inside the sunroom was thick enough to feel like a physical pressure, the investigators nursing their own drinks, their eyes tracking the slow, rhythmic movement of the old man's wrinkled fingers as he lifted the cup to his lips between the turning of his book's pages. With every sip, Pendleton was leaving behind thousands of microscopic epithelial cells from his saliva, a fresh, vibrant repository of his genomic DNA, trapped in the porous composition of the paper rim. He was completely oblivious to the digital trap closing around him, his mind entirely focused on the text of his architectural history, a man who believed he had outrun the law, outrun the memory of the city, and outrun the very concept of earthly judgment. At precisely 10 a.m., Pendleton reached the end of his reading session. He closed the book with a soft, definitive thud, adjusted his grip on his silver walking cane, and slowly rose from the wicker chair, his joints stiff from the morning chill. He turned his body toward the residential wing, walking past the undercover operators with a slow, shuffling pace that carried no indicator of suspicion, completely leaving the disposable paper cup resting on the small wicker side table next to his plate, a routine, thoughtless gesture of abandonment that legally dissolved his right to privacy over the biological blueprints left behind on the rim. The moment the heavy glass transition door clicked shut behind the old man, the extraction protocol was executed with flawless precision. One investigator stood up, deliberately creating a small distraction by dropping his portfolio near the main corridor entry, while the second operator glided across the floor toward the empty corner booth. With a single, continuous motion that looked entirely natural to any casual observer, he drew a pair of sterile plastic forceps and a heavy-duty, anti-contamination security pouch from inside his jacket. He gripped the disposable cup firmly by its base, ensuring that his gloved fingers never made contact with the rim, and dropped it cleanly into the pouch, pulling the airtight, tamper-evident seal closed with a sharp, definitive snap. The entire collection had taken less than 5 seconds, executed so smoothly that none of the nursing staff or residents in the busy sunroom noticed the transition. The investigator slid the secure pouch back into his vest, walked calmly past the reception desk, and exited the facility, climbing into an unmarked transport vehicle that was idling near the southern gates. Within 10 minutes of Arthur Pendleton leaving the sunroom, his discarded coffee cup was inside a temperature-controlled mobile storage unit, rushing down the interstate under emergency police escort toward the primary state forensic facility in Austin, where the final, unappealable verdict of modern science was waiting to be written. The digital dragnet had completed its long journey through time and lineage, ignoring the boundaries of 52 winters, bypassing the blind spots of the national criminal indexes, and penetrating the most sophisticated social camouflage imaginable to reduce the entire mystery of Hanover Street down to a few drops of dried saliva on a piece of common trash. The technology that had resurrected Rosemary Lynch's voice from the dust of 1974 was now poised to deliver the definitive, crushing indictment against the man who had stolen her life. As the transport vehicle disappeared into the highway traffic, leaving the peaceful gardens of Whispering Pines behind, Detective Thorne knew that the long illusion was coming to an end, and that the historic city of Boston was about to wake up to a reality that would reshape its understanding of human deception forever. The final phase of the forensic verification took place within the ultra-clean rooms of the State Molecular Diagnostics Unit, where the automated genetic sequencers operated under a continuous, high-priority mandate. The swab taken from the paper cup's rim was subjected to a standard short tandem repeat, STR, analysis, targeting the 24 distinct genetic loci that serve as the universal standard for human identity within the modern judicial system. The laboratory technicians worked through the night, running the sample parallel to the historic profile retrieved from the 1974 silk scarf, their instruments measuring the exact length of the DNA fragments with a laser precision that left absolutely no room for human bias or statistical error. When the two profiles were displayed side by side on the primary analysis workstation on Friday morning, the digital peaks aligned with a terrifying, absolute exactness that left the investigative team in a state of solemn awe. At every single one of the 24 loci, the allele designations were identical, generating a match statistic that defied human comprehension. There was a less than 1 in 740 quadrillion chance that the DNA profile left on that silk scarf belonged to anyone other than Arthur Pendleton Jr. The science had spoken with a clarity that rendered any defense strategy completely useless. The gentle garden keeper of Whispering Pines was, without a shadow of a single doubt, the Hanover Street monster. Armed with a definitive laboratory report and a signed warrant for capital murder, Detective Thorne and a convoy of state tactical units moved toward the retirement facility at 7 a.m., the morning sun casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete driveway as they prepared to execute the final takedown. The arrest was swift, quiet, and devastating in its social impact. The image of the white-haired patriarch being led away in heavy steel handcuffs, leaving the facility staff in a state of acute, paralyzed shock. The carefully constructed mask of vulnerable old age had been violently ripped away, proving that time possesses no power to wash away the stain of a capital crime, and that the truth is an unyielding force that will eventually hunt down its creator, even if it has to traverse half a century of darkness to find the light. The physical evidence from the Hanover Street homicide did not belong to the modern world of computerized tracking barcodes, vacuum-sealed Mylar pouches, and climate-controlled forensic lockers. It belonged to a grittier, purely analog era of mid-70s law enforcement. When Detective Marcus Thorne carried Box 1974 out of the deep basement repository of the Suffolk County Courthouse, he was handling a literal time capsule of urban horror. The box itself was an old, heavy-gauge cardboard container that had turned a brittle, mottled ochre color over 52 winters, its corners split and reinforced with layers of cracked, yellowed masking tape that flaked off like dead skin at the slightest touch. Across the front, written in the heavy, aggressive strokes of an old grease pencil that had faded to a dull charcoal smudge, were the words, "Lynch, Rosemary, Homicide, November 19th, 1974, Exhibit Master." Inside this fragile paper tomb lay the unvarnished remnants of a stolen life, preserved in a primitive state of stasis, waiting for human knowledge to advance to a point where the silent fabric could finally identify its attacker. The workspace where Thorne initiated the processing was a sterile, negative-pressure forensic laboratory designed specifically to prevent any possibility of modern environmental cross-contamination. The air inside the room was completely recycled every 90 seconds through high-efficiency particulate air filters, and the long stainless steel examination benches were washed with a sequence of bleach, alcohol, and deionized water to erase any stray cellular signatures from the living world. Thorne wore a full-body protective suit, triple-layered nitrile gloves, and an airtight clear facial shield, knowing that his greatest enemy was not the defense attorneys or the passage of time, but his own biology. A single loose skin flake, a microscopic droplet of saliva from a cough, or a stray hair from his arm could instantly contaminate a sample this old, ruining a multi-jurisdictional capital murder prosecution before the indictment could even be read into the record. With the slow, deliberate movements of a surgeon executing a high-stakes procedure, Thorne used a sterile scalpel to cut through the brittle cords that bound the box lid. As the cardboard seal broke, a distinct, heavy odor drifted up into the workspace, the unmistakable, claustrophobic scent of half a century of dark storage, a mixture of decomposing cellulose, dry wool fibers, and the faint, sweet, metallic trace of ancient iron. The top layer of the box contained the original manual paperwork of the file, bound together with rusted metal paper clips that had bled deep orange stains into the edges of the typed pages. These were the original field notes, the handwritten timeline charts, and the formal police sheets produced on mechanical typewriters by detectives who had long since grown old, retired, and passed away into the city's cemeteries, their signatures the only surviving human connection to the immediate aftermath of the violence. Beneath the paper trail lay the high-gloss, black-and-white crime scene photographs, their surfaces slightly curled and stuck together by decades of Boston humidity, requiring Thorne to use a heated microspatula to separate the sheets with agonizing slowness. As the images pulled apart with a faint, crisp snapping sound, the raw reality of the 1974 crime exploded back into the light of the modern room. There was Rosemary Lynch, frozen at 21 years old, lying on her small wooden mattress inside the third-floor Hanover Street apartment. The camera flash had captured the stark, monochromatic contrasts of the scene with a brutal, exposing clarity. The textbooks stacked neatly on her desk, the glass of water sitting untouched on her nightstand, and the deep, dark circular bruising that ringed her throat where her own silk scarf had been turned into an instrument of absolute erasure. The forensic anomalies of the scene stood out to Thorne's modern analytical eyes like beacons against a dark background. The original 1974 detectives had meticulously documented the total lack of forced entry, concluding that Rosemary must have opened her door willingly to someone she recognized, but they lacked the behavioral profiling capability to read the deeper psychological architecture of the space. The photographs showed that the apartment was otherwise completely unransacked. The dresser drawers were closed. The jewelry on the vanity was undisturbed, and a delicate porcelain figurine sitting near the edge of the shelf remained upright without a single scratch. The killer had moved through the apartment with an extraordinary, chilling level of spatial comfort and mechanical calm, navigating the narrow layout of the tenement in the dead of night without causing a single sound that would alert the neighbors sleeping on the opposite side of the lath and plaster walls. Thorne reached past the photographic plates to retrieve the primary biological repository of the case, a large, heavy-gauge paper evidence sack sealed with staples and red wax impressions displaying the long-defunct seal of the Boston Police Homicide Bureau. Inside this bag was the vintage patterned silk scarf that the coroner had cut from Rosemary's neck during the post-mortem examination on the morning of November 20th. The fabric was a delicate, Italian silk weave featuring a pattern of geometric crimson and cream shapes, but the bright colors were now muted, covered in large, irregular patches of a dark, stiff discoloration where her lifeblood and cellular fluid had pooled during her final, desperate struggle for breath. The scarf was the physical baseline of the entire mystery, a piece of material culture that had been transformed from a common article of personal fashion into an unyielding, material witness to an extraordinary act of depravity. In 1974, the State Forensic Laboratory could do nothing more with this scarf than determine that the fluid stains aligned with type A blood, a common biological marker shared by nearly 40% of the male population, a result that rendered the evidence virtually useless for narrowing down an individual suspect pool. But Thorne knew that the weave of natural silk possessed a unique, microscopic physical geometry that was highly efficient at trapping and preserving cellular material over long expanses of time. When an offender wraps a piece of fabric around a victim's throat and applies the immense physical leverage required to cause high-pressure asphyxiation, the friction of their hands against the material forces thousands of microscopic epithelial cells, the flat, protective skin flakes that cover human palms and fingers, deep into the internal matrix of the threads. The compression of the struggle acts like a biological stamp, sealing the suspect's genomic identity inside the tight, twisted fibers of the silk, creating a permanent, invisible record that no amount of superficial air exposure or passage of decades could completely eradicate. The dry, dark, and cold conditions of the courthouse basement had inadvertently acted as a perfect preservation chamber, protecting the delicate DNA molecules from the destructive, splitting effects of ultraviolet sunlight and ambient moisture. The cellular signature of Arthur Pendleton Jr. had been sleeping inside those crimson and cream threads for 52 years, safe from the outside world, waiting for the arrival of a technology that could read the language of its code. Thorne placed the scarf container into a secure, computerized transfer pod, sealing the electronic locks with his personal biometric signature before moving the evidence out of the county precinct and onto the highway heading toward the state's Central Molecular Analytics Division in Austin. The transfer was monitored in real time by a logistics team using continuous GPS tracking, a strict legal requirement designed to ensure that the chain of custody remained unbroken and completely unchallengeable by any defense team. The state laboratory was an imposing complex of steel and glass, a stark contrast to the wood-paneled, analog world of the Boston Archives, housing the most advanced high-throughput genetic sequencing platforms in the country. Inside the extraction suite, a senior molecular geneticist named Dr. Elena Vance took possession of the secure pod, logging the verification marks with a digital stylus. She looked through the clear viewing window at the yellowed paper sack from 1974, her expression shifting from professional detachment to deep, historical focus. "This is primitive evidence preservation," she noted, adjusting the negative pressure controls on her containment hood. But the natural silk fibers are remarkably stable. If the epithelial cells are trapped inside the internal matrix of the knots, we should be able to separate the perpetrator's genetic profile from the victim's background cellular noise without destroying the structural integrity of the fabric. The process of pulling usable genomic DNA from a half-century-old textile sample is a delicate, multi-stage chemical operation that requires hours of preparation before any analytical instrument can be deployed. Dr. Vance used a pair of sterile, microforceps to extract millimetric swatches of the silk from the specific areas of the scarf that showed the highest probability of direct suspect contact, the loops of the primary knot, and the inner margins where the killer's fingers would have dug into the material to maintain their grip. These tiny fragments of fabric were placed into specialized microcentrifuge tubes containing an advanced lysis buffer cocktail infused with specialized enzymes designed to dissolve the protective cellular membranes of the skin flakes without shearing the delicate strands of DNA contained within their nuclei. The tubes were loaded into an automated thermal mixer that agitated the solution at a constant temperature of 56 degrees Celsius for 3 hours, accelerating the breakdown of the biological matrix until any foreign genetic material was suspended in a few drops of clear, pristine liquid. The primary difficulty lay in the fact that the DNA from 1974 was severely degraded, its long, complex molecular chains broken by time into short, fragmented pieces like an ancient parchment manuscript that had been put through an office shredder. Standard forensic validation methods, such as early polymerase chain reaction techniques from the 1990s, would have found nothing but an unreadable biological smudge, entirely useless for a formal criminal match. To overcome this limitation, Dr. Vance deployed next-generation sequencing, NGS, an extraordinary leap in forensic science that bypasses the limitations of traditional database testing. NGS instruments utilize a process known as sequencing by synthesis, loading the clear DNA solution onto a specialized microfluidic flow cell where hundreds of thousands of individual genetic fragments are amplified and read simultaneously. The instrument reads single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, the tiny, individual variations in a human genome that determine everything from ancestral lineage to specific physical characteristics, allowing a high-powered computer algorithm to cross-reference the overlapping ends of the fragmented pieces, systematically stitching the ancient biological blueprint back together until a flawless, high-density digital signature emerged from the forensic mist. For 3 continuous days, Detective Thorne lived in a small hotel room near the laboratory complex, unable to rest, his mind constantly recycling the possibilities of failure. He understood that if this extraction failed, if the DNA was too degraded or if there was not enough suspect material trapped in the silk to build a complete profile, the Hanover Street case would hit a permanent wall. There would be no second chances, no other boxes of physical evidence to pull from the archives. On the morning of the 4th day, the text alert on his phone broke the silence of his room, displaying a short message from Dr. Vance. Marcus, the sequencer has finished its run. We have the data layout. Come into the suite immediately. When Thorne entered the primary analysis bay, Dr. Vance pointed her stylus toward a massive dual-monitor setup that displayed a series of sharp, colorful graphic peaks and long, dense strings of alphanumeric text that looked like lines of computer code. We achieved a near-perfect extraction, she said, her voice tight with professional triumph. The differential chemical separation worked exactly as intended. We managed to pull a clean, completely independent foreign male DNA profile from the deep fibers of the primary knot. The sample was small, but the next-generation sequencing has allowed us to map over 850,000 SNP markers across the entire genome. It's an absolute, unassailable biological signature of the killer. Thorne stepped closer to the glass partition, his eyes tracking the digital peaks that represented the physical reality of the man who had walked out of Rosemary Lynch's apartment 52 years before. Did we get a match inside the National Index? He asked, his voice low and tense, referring to CODIS, the combined DNA index system that contains the biometric profiles of millions of convicted felons, parolees, and active arrestees across the United States. Dr. Vance shook her head, her expression turning serious. We ran it against the state database and the federal database twice under an emergency priority search flag. The system returned a definitive, immediate notification of 0 matches. The perpetrator has never been convicted of a felony, he's never been processed into a facility that requires a routine cheek swab, and he's never served time in a state or federal correctional institution anywhere in this country. He's an absolute ghost on paper, Marcus. He's out there somewhere, living a completely clean, unblemished life in the eyes of the law. The disappointment hit Thorne like a physical blow, draining the nervous energy that had carried him through the week. A flawless biological profile was technically useless if there was no name to print on the indictment. It was a fingerprint without an identity, a beautiful piece of scientific proof that could do nothing to close the file unless they could find the living human being who carried the matching code in his veins. He stared at the monitor, realizing that the traditional methods of law enforcement had reached their absolute structural limit. The databases were blind, the paper trail was dead, and the predator had successfully navigated 5 decades of life without ever leaving a single digital footprint in the criminal justice system. "Don't unpack your bags just yet," Dr. Vance said, noticing the slump in the detective's posture as she pulled up a secondary software interface. CODIS is a closed, rigid system that only looks at known criminals, but the world has moved far past that architecture. There are other databases out there, massive, public networks containing the genetic profiles of millions of ordinary citizens who have voluntarily uploaded their DNA to discover their family heritages and build their family trees. We have the data density required to move this profile out of the criminal forensics world and into the realm of investigative genetic genealogy. We can't find him through his own record, Marcus, but we can find him through his relatives. This was the critical shift that would completely redefine the trajectory of the investigation, transforming it from a localized police hunt into a global, digital dragnet that would traverse generations of family history to track down a single, hidden branch of a bloodline. Investigative genetic genealogy was the science that had shattered the anonymity of some of the world's most elusive historical fugitives, leveraging the public's obsession with ancestry and identity to tear down the walls of privacy that criminals used to shield themselves from their past. By uploading the killer's high-density SNP profile into public databases like GeneMatch and Family Tree DNA, the forensic genealogists could search for long segments of shared DNA between the unknown suspect and millions of everyday users who had used home DNA kits. The entire process was governed by the immutable, mathematical laws of biological inheritance. A child shares precisely 50% of their DNA with each biological parent, 25% with their grandparents, and smaller, statistically predictable percentages with their second, third, and fourth cousins, measured in centimorgans. If the Hanover Street Monster had a cousin, a niece, or a distant uncle who had ever submitted a saliva sample to a genealogy website to find out if they had Irish or Italian heritage, that connection would show up on the digital grid, exposing a shared lineage that could be traced back to a common set of great-grandparents. The killer believed he had secured his safety by remaining a law-abiding citizen for 50 years, completely unaware that his own family members, operating out of nothing more than innocent historical curiosity about their roots, were systematically dismantling his alibi from their own living rooms. Thorne authorized the immediate transfer of the high-density data file to a specialized investigative genealogy unit headed by a renowned specialist in genetic mapping. As the digital file was uploaded into the public servers, the computer algorithms began their silent work, cross-referencing the 850,000 markers against millions of profiles, searching for the tiny, overlapping segments of code that indicated a blood relationship. It was an invisible process that took place across servers located around the world, a dragnet that cared nothing for the passage of time, the social status of the suspect, or the pristine reputation he had built for himself in the decades since the crime. While the digital search was running, Thorne returned to Boston, going back to the empty, quiet room where Box 1974 had sat for so long. He looked at the empty shelf space, then down at the yellowed notebooks containing the original statements from the neighbors, the family, and the shopkeepers who had gathered to weep on Hanover Street in the winter of 1974. He realized with a chilling certainty that the answer was already in motion, that the microscopic phantoms extracted from Rosemary's silk scarf were currently hunting their creator through the digital landscape, moving closer and closer with every passing second. The killer had spent 52 years believing that the concrete walls of the courthouse basement were his best friends, that as long as the box remained sealed and the dust remained undisturbed, he was safe. He had no idea that the tomb had been opened, that the science of the future had resurrected the voice of his victim, and that the past was currently marching down the highway toward his quiet retirement home, preparing to tear his world apart at the seams. The transition from the digital mapping rooms of the genealogy unit to the physical reality of a tactical operation occurred with an icy, bureaucratic speed that left no room for hesitation. Armed with the definitive laboratory match and the signed capital murder warrant, Detective Thorne and a convoy of state tactical units moved toward the Whispering Pines senior facility on a crisp Tuesday morning, the sun casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete driveway as they prepared to execute the final takedown. The arrest was executed with absolute precision inside the doorway of Suite 114, the sudden intrusion of armed state troopers instantly freezing the 80-year-old suspect against his kitchen counter, his white-haired frame drawing down as if the invisible weight of his 52-year secret had suddenly become a physical force that crushed his spine. The subsequent interrogation at the high-security downtown precinct was a masterclass in psychological collapse, as Thorne laid out the genetic evidence, the ancestral family trees, and the bright crime scene photographs from 1974 on the table between them. For the first 2 hours, Arthur Pendleton Jr. attempted to maintain his vulnerable, grandfatherly persona, speaking in a low, trembling whisper about memory lapses, confusion, and mistaken identity, his wrinkled hands shaking as he reached for his water cup. But as Thorne systematically detailed the mathematical certainty of the DNA match, showing how the molecular signatures from the disposable paper cup and the silk scarf were identical down to the smallest allele marker, the old man's defensive facade completely splintered, revealing a flat, dead stare that had remained unchanged since the night of the murder. He did not offer a grand confession or a detailed explanation of his long-hidden motive. He simply looked away from the photographs, his absolute silence confirming the monstrous truth that the city of Boston had spent 52 years desperately trying to uncover. The public release of the arrest details sent a monumental shockwave through the historic neighborhoods of Boston, destroying the collective memory of the tragedy and replacing it with a profound, sickening sense of violation that touched every citizen who had ever carried the scar of 1974. The realization that an active killer had spent his entire adult life enjoying the safety, the love, and the opportunities of the city he had terrorized created a collective sense of trauma that was nearly impossible for the public to process. The courtroom during the preliminary hearings was a suffocating, claustrophobic arena of raw emotion, packed with the surviving relatives of the victim, childhood friends who were now elderly citizens, and ordinary people who wanted to look into the eyes of the man who had beaten the system for half a century. The cold case was officially closed. The genetic signature on a simple paper cup had proven that time possesses no power to wash away the stain of a capital crime, but as the prison doors locked Arthur Pendleton away for the remainder of his natural days, the city was left with the chilling knowledge that the ultimate evil can live among us, growing old in the light while the truth waits in the dark. The physical perimeter of the Whispering Pines senior living facility was bounded by a low, ornamental wrought iron fence and a border of mature weeping willow trees that dipped their branches toward manicured ryegrass lawns, creating an unshakable illusion of domestic safety, privilege, and permanent rest. To the casual eye, or to the families who paid thousands of dollars a month to secure housing for their aging relatives within its walls, the estate was a peaceful sanctuary completely cut off from the chaotic, gritty realities of the modern city outside the gates. But on Monday morning, that serene landscape was transformed into a high-priority, multi-jurisdictional surveillance matrix, an invisible tactical cage established by the Special Investigations Division of the State Police. The objective was not to breach the fortress with flashbangs and tactical armor, but to occupy the space silently, using the tools of deep counterintelligence to monitor an 80-year-old resident whose genetic history had just collided with a 52-year-old capital murder file. Detective Marcus Thorne sat inside the rear compartment of a standard, white commercial utility van parked along the northern shoulder of the access road, less than 100 yards from the facility's main courtyard entrance. The interior of the vehicle was completely stripped of its commercial utility fixtures, replaced instead with a compact, state-of-the-art technical monitoring station, dual rack-mounted digital recording decks, a stabilized thermal imaging control console, and a bank of high-definition monitors that displayed the live feeds from 4 independent, plainclothes operators positioned across the grounds. The air inside the van was cool, conditioned to preserve the operational limits of the electronics, smelling faintly of clean copper wiring, insulation foam, and the stale black coffee that Thorne had used to sustain his awareness through 48 hours of continuous preparation. Target is exiting the residential portal. A quiet, flat voice crackled through Thorne's encrypted earpiece, the transmission originating from investigator Sarah Reynolds, who was dressed in the civilian attire of an ordinary landscape architect, carrying a digital tablet and a professional camera casing near the Western Gardens. Thorne adjusted his main control stick, bringing Monitor 1 into focus as the heavy glass transition doors of the facility's residential wing slid open. There, stepping out onto the concrete pavement of the walkway, was Arthur Pendleton Jr. To any ordinary citizen walking past him, he was the absolute embodiment of vulnerable, dignified old age, a tall, slightly stooped senior citizen wearing a neatly pressed tweed jacket over a silver wool cardigan, his left hand gripping a polished mahogany walking cane that clicked softly against the pavement with every step. His silver hair was combed with a precise, military neatness, and his face carried a soft, relaxed expression of grandfatherly benevolence that had earned him the profound affection of the care nurses who managed his daily schedule. Watching the high-definition feed zoom in on Pendleton's face, Thorne felt a deep, chilling sense of cognitive dissonance that went far beyond the standard professional detachment of a homicide detective. He was looking at a man who had spent 41 years working as a trusted field technician for the Boston Edison Utility Company, a man who had raised a family, paid his mortgages on time, attended neighborhood block parties, and retired to this quiet sanctuary surrounded by the love of his grandchildren. On paper, his life was a testament to absolute civic compliance and domestic virtue. He was the neighbor you trusted with your house keys, the grandfather you invited to graduation dinners, the quiet citizen who never generated a single line of negative history in any local registry. Yet, beneath that beautiful layer of social camouflage lay the unyielding, material reality of the 1974 silk scarf, the biological certainty that those identical, wrinkled hands had been the ones to violently choke the life out of Rosemary Lynch inside her Hanover Street bedroom. The primary tactical objective of Operation Hanover Shadow was governed by a severe, uncompromising legal standard that left the investigators with absolutely no margin for error. The high-density single nucleotide polymorphism data pulled from the historical crime scene by next-generation sequencing was a powerful investigative guide, an arrow pointing directly to the Pendleton bloodline, but it was not legally sufficient to secure a grand jury indictment or a conviction for capital murder. To satisfy the strict evidentiary protocols of the Massachusetts judicial system, law enforcement had to obtain a direct, standard short tandem repeat reference profile from the suspect's own body through a controlled, certified forensic extraction. Thorne needed Arthur Pendleton's actual biological material, his blood, his hair, or his saliva, and he had to secure it through a surreptitious collection, capturing abandoned property in a public space before the suspect realized the state had opened his box of secrets. The legal strategy of a surreptitious collection was a delicate chess match played against the Fourth Amendment's protections against unreasonable search and seizure. If an investigator stepped onto the property, approached Pendleton with a cotton swab, and demanded a cheek cell sample without a signed judicial warrant, the resulting profile would be thrown out of court instantly as an illegal search, destroying decades of preserved evidence in a single second. But under the established legal doctrines of abandoned property, if an individual voluntarily discards an item in a public or communal space, a soda can thrown into a public trash receptacle, a cigarette butt dropped on a sidewalk, or a disposable cup left behind on a restaurant table, they legally relinquish their expectation of privacy over that object. The item becomes common waste, free for any citizen or any law enforcement officer to claim, analyze, and use as primary evidence in a court of law. The challenge for Thorne's surveillance detail lay in the hyper-controlled, meticulously clean environment of the Whispering Pines facility itself. The estate operated with a level of domestic efficiency that made the acquisition of abandoned property an extraordinary logistical nightmare. The indoor lounges and communal dining halls were managed by a dedicated janitorial staff that cleared tables and washed dishes with an aggressive speed, leaving no items sitting unmonitored for more than a few minutes. If Pendleton used a ceramic mug during a facility luncheon, the vessel was instantly carried away to a high-temperature industrial dishwasher, the high-pressure water and chemical detergents systematically destroying any trace of his epithelial cells before an undercover operator could position themselves to intercept the evidence. Thorne needed a situation where the target was operating outside his standard domestic layout, using a disposable item in a common pavilion where his garbage would be left entirely to his own responsibility. On the morning of the third day of the operation, the tactical grid began to align in the state's favor. The heavy ground fog that had obscured the suburban landscape for 48 hours finally cleared under a crisp, bright autumn sun, raising the temperature inside the facility's central courtyard and drawing the residents out toward the communal sunroom, a large, glass-enclosed pavilion that extended out from the western wing of the main building. Monitor 2 showed Pendleton navigating the walkway with his standard, slow pace, his book on historical New England architecture tucked firmly under his right arm. He bypassed the central garden beds and entered the sunroom, his leather shoes clicking softly against the terracotta tile floor as he approached the automated beverage station near the entrance. Inside the surveillance van, Thorne watched the target's hands through a high-powered 4K optical lens that allowed him to count the individual lines on Pendleton's knuckles. The pastor's brother reached for a standard, white disposable paper cup from the dispenser, filled it with hot chamomile tea from the commercial urn, and navigated his way toward a high-backed wicker armchair located in the quietest corner of the sunroom, completely isolated from the main seating clusters where other residents were gathering to review the morning papers. This was the precise layout Thorne had been waiting for. A disposable cup meant that when the reading session concluded, the object would not be preserved or processed by the care staff. It would be treated as temporary trash, an item destined for the bin. Teams 2 and 3 execute the interior positioning protocol, Thorne whispered into his microphone, his command triggering an instantaneous, silent response across the tactical channel. Investigator Sarah Reynolds and a second plainclothes officer, looking entirely like a pair of middle-aged siblings visiting an aging parent, entered the sunroom through the northern corridor, their movements casual, relaxed, and completely non-threatening. They moved into the seating grid, securing a low-glass table less than 12 feet from Pendleton's position, their posture open as they unrolled a medical brochure and began talking in quiet, conversational tones about a fictional rehabilitation schedule. At the same time, the operator in the utility vehicle outside synchronized his high-definition video camera, locking the frame onto the rim of Pendleton's cup through a gap in the exterior window slats, initiating a continuous, unedited digital record of the physical transfer. For 45 grueling minutes, the psychological tension inside the surveillance then reached a suffocating frequency as Thorne watched the slow, mechanical progression of the target's reading routine. Pendleton sat completely at ease, his legs crossed at the ankle, his silver walking cane leaning against the wicker arm of his chair as he turned the pages of his architectural history with a slow, practiced rhythm. Every few minutes, his wrinkled fingers would close around the base of the white paper cup, lifting it to his lips to take a slow, deliberate sip of the hot tea. Through the high-resolution monitors, Thorne could see the slight indentation where Pendleton's mouth pressed firmly against the porous paper rim, leaving behind hundreds of invisible epithelial cells from his saliva, a fresh, undamaged reservoir of his unique genomic identity, pressed into the weave of the material with every contact. The continuous video recording was a vital legal requirement, a mechanism designed to prove to a future trial judge that the cup had never been contaminated by an outside source from the moment it left Pendleton's hand to the moment it was sealed in an evidence container. If a defense attorney could argue that a care nurse had touched the rim while clearing the table, or that another resident had brushed past the wicker stand, the scientific validity of the resulting DNA match could be compromised under the rules of evidence. The camera had to capture a flawless, unbroken visual record of custody, proving that the biological blueprint extracted by the forensics lab belonged exclusively to the suspect and no one else. At precisely 10:05 a.m., Pendleton reached the conclusion of his reading chapter. He closed the heavy leather-bound book with a soft, definitive thud that carried across the quiet pavilion, adjusted his glasses, and reached into his cardigan pocket to retrieve a clean handkerchief to wipe his brow. He then grasped his silver walking cane, using the leverage of his right arm to slowly lift his tall frame out of the deep wicker chair, his joints stiff from the morning chill. He turned his body toward the residential corridor, heading back toward his suite for his scheduled mid-morning medical evaluation, completely leaving the disposable paper cup sitting carelessly on the small wicker-side table next to his empty plate, a thoughtless, routine gesture of abandonment that legally dissolved his expectation of privacy and transferred ownership of his biological identity directly to the state of Massachusetts. The moment the heavy glass transition door clicked shut behind the old man, the interior extraction protocol was executed with flawless, professional speed. Investigator Reynolds stood up from her table, smoothly positioning her body to block the line of sight from the main reception desk, while her partner glided across the terracotta tile toward the empty wicker booth. With a single, continuous motion that looked completely natural to any casual observer, he drew a pair of sterile plastic forceps and a heavy-duty, anti-contamination security pouch from inside his utility vest. He gripped the disposable cup firmly by its base, ensuring that his gloved fingers never made contact with the rim, and dropped it cleanly into the pouch, pulling the airtight, tamper-evident security seal closed with a sharp, definitive snap. The collection was completed in less than 5 seconds, executed so smoothly that none of the other residents or nursing staff in the busy pavilion noticed the transition. The investigator slid the secure pouch back into his vest, walked calmly past the registration desk, and exited the main facility doors, climbing into the front seat of an unmarked transport vehicle that had been idling near the southern perimeter gates. Within 10 minutes of Arthur Pendleton Jr. leaving the sunroom, his discarded cup was sitting inside a temperature-controlled mobile storage unit, rushing down the interstate under emergency police escort toward the primary state forensic headquarters in Austin, where the final, unappealable verdict of modern science was waiting to be written. The surveillance matrix had performed its duty with absolute, clinical perfection. It had occupied the pristine spaces of the retirement home, operated beneath the radar of the target's 40 years of social camouflage, and reduced the entire mystery of the 1974 Hanover Street homicide down to a few drops of dried saliva on a piece of common trash. The technology that had resurrected Rosemary Lynch's voice from the dust of the county courthouse basement was now poised to deliver the definitive, crushing indictment against the man who had stolen her future. As the transport vehicle disappeared into the morning highway traffic, leaving the peaceful gardens of Whispering Pines far behind, Detective Thorne shut down the monitors inside the white utility van, knowing that the long game was finally coming to an end, and that the historic city of Boston was about to confront a reality that would change its understanding of human deception forever. The final phase of the forensic verification took place within the